What's up everyone, how are you all? Today we are back with another blazing Naruto story. What if Naruto became the devil of temptation? And every woman wanted to belong to him. If you enjoy, then please like, share and do comments. Naruto was known throughout his village for a couple things. Besides the hatred and disgust that seemed to follow him everywhere, Naruto was known for his pranks and his volume. Naruto was loud. In fact, except for his rare moments of public loneliness, he was almost never quiet at all. Even in his academy classes he seemed perpetually unable to keep still and quiet long enough to hear any of the lessons they taught. It wasn't entirely his fault though. It was just that everyone else was so quiet. Besides, how was he supposed to hear himself if he was as quiet as the rest of them? How was he supposed to hear them if they never spoke louder? It wasn't as if they helped him either. Whenever he asked someone to repeat themselves, they just got angry and yelled at him. Everyone yelled at him. Adults yelled at him, telling him to stay away from their shops or their kids, or just to stay away from everyone. Kids yelled at him too. They called him a loser or dead last or dumb and a monster or demon, just like their parents did, parroting the words he heard regularly from adults at the same volume. Naruto didn't understand though. If he was always too loud, why did no one yell at them for being too loud? He was 11 and kids who were older than him were louder sometimes, and they only shook their heads fondly, saying something like, "Kids," in a nostalgic tone. It wasn't fair. He was always torn with things like that. He wanted so badly to be acknowledged, to be seen as more than a monster, and he still didn't understand why they called him that to begin with. So much has come to just accept that that's how they saw him. To be seen for who he was and not whatever they thought he was. On the other hand, he often wondered if it would stop if he just faded. Stopped pranking, stopped being loud, just stopped. He supposed the only thing stopping him was the fact that he knew that even if he did stop they wouldn't, it would only make things worse for him. They'd probably think he was plotting something or something equally stupid. Because Naruto loved Konoha no matter how much it seemed to hate him. Because despite that he still had the Sandame and Iruka-sensei, the newest instructor at the academy. He, at least, didn't let any hatred he might feel for Naruto get in the way of his job like his other teachers, even if he did get mad when Naruto asked him to repeat himself or speak up. Naruto didn't understand why everyone was so angry about it, and every time someone yelled at him for simply asking them to repeat something, he felt just a bit lonelier than he did before. Especially when it was Iruka-sensei, since the man had been one of the first to touch him, hold him, so gently without meaning harm or needing to be bribed or coerced like the ones who'd looked after him when he'd been at the orphanage, not that he'd been there for long. Being constantly in the villagers' sights, their thoughts, because of his awesome pranks also meant things being thrown at him when he passed by, not to mention the abuse his poor apartment dealt with on a weekly basis were common occurrences. So when he felt a sharp pain in the back of his head and then blackness, well, if he hadn't been knocked out by the attack he wouldn't have been surprised. What did surprise him, however, was waking up in a sewer. The lights were dim and everything was monochrome in ugly yellow-green browns with cloudy, ankle-deep water and a constant dripping sound. There were multiple tunnels to walk through, and he noticed almost immediately that something was different here. Because the dripping sounds weren't loud but he heard them clearly, and every step he took in the shallow water didn't sound dull and fuzzy but instead sounded clear and crisp, and it was amazing. As he made his way down the sewer, he still wasn't sure where he was or why he was there, but finding a way out seemed more important. He followed the low rumble coming from the left and large pipes and annoying drips that seemed to be everywhere. The rumbling led him to a room with a large gate that blended in with everything else in the sewer. It was tall, not as tall as the Hokage mountain but tall, and in the middle where the lock would be was a paper with the lone kanji seal written neatly in perfect calligraphy. Naruto could hear movement, water splashing and something rustling behind the gate, and could feel that he wasn't alone. He could feel the power of whatever was hiding in the shadows of the gate and the darkness and hatred that poured off of whatever it was. Large red, slitted eyes and a sharp grin full of teeth became visible in the darkness, and the power he felt seemed to grow as the thing behind the gate stared down at him. Any fear he felt was overpowered by his endless curiosity, and the fact that the thing looking at him was behind a locked gate was helpful too. Naruto looked up into the large cat-like eyes and grinned brightly. "Hi, I'm Uzumaki Naruto. Do you happen to know where I am?" He realized just how loud he spoke as his voice echoed around the room. The thing rumbled again and orange fur and large tails became visible, and only then did Naruto understand what he was seeing. This was the Kyuubi no Kitsune, the beast the Yondaime had defeated the night he was born. He stepped back a bit and the large fox seemed to smirk. You dare wake the great Kyuubi no Kitsune? Why are you here, insolent mortal? The fox's deep voice growled out and Naruto winced, unused to such volume. It was an accident? I just kind of woke up here and you don't know how to get out. Why are you here? Where is here? Naruto stumbled over his words as he rushed to answer the large fox. I'm here because you're Yondaime. He spat the title in a way Naruto had only ever heard directed at him. Sealed me here, inside you. We are inside your mind, dumb brat. The blonde turned pale as the realization set in. The Kyuubi no Kitsune, the nine-tailed fox that attacked Konoha 11 years earlier, was sealed inside him. Why was he never told? Did everyone else know? Was that why everyone hated him, why he was alone? He didn't say anything for a while, and something that wasn't quite pity or sympathy filled the deep red eyes of the fox as he stared down at the blonde's quivering form. When he finally gathered his thoughts, Naruto began speaking again. Why? Why me? Why did you attack? Why is everything here weird? His voice was full of emotion, full of anger and sadness and desperation. The Kyuubi was almost tempted to tell him about the blonde fool that sealed him or the damn Uchiha and his damn eyes, but instead he chose to focus on the last question. What do you mean weird, brat? It wasn't concerned, not quite, but it was curious and lacked the bite the fox's other statements had barely contained. It was almost comforting. Normally everything sounds quiet, but in here everything is loud. I guess compared to how it was before this is. Naruto thought for a moment, face scrunching up. Clearer? I dunno how to explain it. Normally I have to ask people to repeat things a lot, ya know? And if I can't see someone I can't always hear him. But now it's like I can hear everything, ya know? The Kyuubi did not, in fact, know. His hearing was excellent and he'd never experienced anything like the boy was describing, but he had witnessed something similar with Mito, his first Jinchuriki. But that hadn't happened until she'd gotten old, before he'd been sealed into the next Uzumaki with her damn chains. This was a child and, as far as he knew, shouldn't be experiencing such a thing. He knew it wasn't from an injury, he would have sensed it and began healing it immediately. It wouldn't do for his Jinchuriki to die, after all. Perhaps it was something in the boy's father's blood. He'd never heard of a pure Uzumaki getting sick, let alone losing their hearing before they were older than the current Hokage. Mito herself had been nearing her 100th year before she died. They were known for their longevity, after all. Whenever I ask him to speak up they get mad at me, though. They're always mad at me. They yell at me to be quiet, but that's hypo-clinical because they're loud too. Besides, how am I supposed to hear myself if I'm quiet? They already call me dumb because I have trouble saying stuff properly sometimes. The Kyuubi didn't bother to correct the blonde's sad attempt at saying hypocritical. So, you can't hear well. It was said mostly to himself, but the blonde either didn't know or didn't care. I just said that. Is that not normal? Until I got here and everything started sounding different I just thought it was normal, ya know? Since everyone's always yelling and all. The only one who doesn't yell is Gigi, but I thought that's because he's old. If I don't watch him carefully I miss a lot of what he says. Deaf, then, or at least hard of hearing. He could already see the question on the boy's face and sighed in exasperation. Deaf means your hearing is impaired or that you can't hear, and hard of hearing means you can't hear well. Does that mean I can't be a ninja? Naruto panicked. If he couldn't be a ninja, how could he ever get the village to acknowledge him? Not exactly, brat. There are ways to work around it. When you got here, you could feel that I was here, right? He wasn't sure why he was helping the brat, but the kid had a magnetism that reminded him of the sage and he couldn't help it. You're a natural chakra sensor. Eventually with my power you might even be able to sense some emotions. You can use that instead of hearing, and there are ways to communicate that don't rely on talking if that also becomes a problem. The kid, he swore, had stars in his crystal blue eyes. Really? His tears and panic had subsided and he actually seemed excited. Apparently the idea of being a ninja was enough to distract the kid from the fact that the beast who'd terrorized his village, and the reason said village hated him, was sealed within him. The fox nodded. That's amazing. Can you teach me how to sense like that? That was not what the Biju expected. The fox sneered, but it didn't seem as sincere as he wanted it to be. Not now, brat. It wasn't a no, you need to wake up. Don't tell anyone we talked. Wait, what's your name? The beast's head snapped down to him, red eyes wide with shock. What? You have a name, don't you? I've never met anybody without a name. If you don't want to tell me that's K, lots of people don't like telling me their names. The kid wasn't even trying to make him feel bad, he was simply stating a fact, but it forced something primal, something he hadn't felt since before he and his siblings were separated, to the forefront of his mind. It's Kurama, Kit, and where did that come from? Years sealed inside a child must be making him soft. The blonde brat grinned up at him with the purest, real happiness, and Kurama almost smiled back. Almost. So, how do I get back? He was cut off by his eyes opening to find he was back in his messy apartment. Apparently that was how. It was early in the morning now. Last he remembered it was late at night and he'd come back from one of his tri-weekly visits to Ichiraku Ramen about an hour before he was hit in the head. A quick look around the room told him he'd been watering his plants before bed, his tiny green watering can on the floor surrounded by dampness, and the thing that had hit him in the head had been a rock. Of course, his hearing was fuzzy compared to how it had been in the sewer, his mind, and he briefly wondered if it were a dream before deciding that it wasn't. How could a dream tell him things he didn't know? Regardless, the difference in his hearing was clear in a way he'd never noticed before, having something to compare to. Muffled, like someone stuffed his ears with cotton and dunked his head under water. He couldn't hear his own breaths like he could in his mind, or really anything else except for the annoying banging from the construction happening on the building next door to his apartment, and he only knew that was the source because he could see it from his window. Otherwise it just kinda sounded like it was everywhere and it drove him crazy. After the encounter, Naruto continued on and followed Kurama's warning? Advice? Order? Whatever it was, he did as he was told and didn't tell anyone about his encounter with the Kyuubi, Kurama, or his apparent deafness, because how was he supposed to explain how he knew? He went on pretending the fact that no one ever told him didn't bother him, continued pretending he wasn't aware at all. It wasn't hard. He continued smiling brightly like always and didn't let up an ounce on his pranking, just like he always did, to hide just how lonely he always was, only he wasn't alone anymore. He had Kurama, even if he didn't quite know how to visit him, how he'd even ended up in his mind when he'd gotten knocked out, since it had happened multiple times before and never talked to a giant fox inside his head, was still a mystery to him. He paid closer attention in his classes but still had trouble hearing what was being said, especially when Iruka-sensei would turn his back to the class or students seated in front of him or behind him would ask questions or answer them. He found himself paying more attention to people's mouths than the actual sounds coming out of them, and writing things down when he did catch them, especially when Iruka-sensei would write things on the chalkboard. If anyone noticed the change, they didn't say anything, and it didn't help that much. He still missed a lot of the lessons, and Iruka-sensei still yelled at him for not paying attention when he was called on. It wasn't enough to pull himself up from the bottom of the class. Iruka could admit that he hadn't always done his best by Naruto. When he'd first been assigned the Demon Brats class, he'd protested quite vehemently, but the Hokage had insisted, and in a lot of ways he was glad. Because, as it turned out, Naruto was anything but a demon. He was friendly, kind, and so lonely. He would have never believed the kid was even capable of feeling anything negative if he hadn't seen him sitting on the wooden swing outside of the academy, eyes downcast and full of so many emotions Iruka understood all too well while watching the other children being picked up by their parents. Sadness and loneliness, jealousy, anger, desperation were all feelings Iruka was intimately familiar with, particularly after the deaths of his parents in the aftermath of the Kyuubi attack. When the scarred Chunin looked at Naruto, more than anything, he saw himself. He was much like the blonde when he was young. He pulled pranks and played off his failures as jokes and didn't really pay attention in class. All for attention, because otherwise he was ignored. While Naruto definitely wasn't completely ignored, it was abundantly clear to anyone who bothered to look to see that all he wanted was acknowledgement. After the incident regarding Naruto trying to loot bodies and nearly getting blown up, the pair had grown closer. Iruka took Naruto out for ramen a couple times a week and listened to the boy vent as much as he allowed himself to, which was another thing entirely. No matter how alone he felt, he was very reluctant to let anyone in, especially when it came to burdening other people with his problems. Iruka supposed having to deal with problems alone for so long would do that to a person and didn't take offense. Iruka did notice a slight change in the boy over the last week, though. It was something he'd spent every night that week thinking about in the dark of his apartment. The fact that Naruto seemed lighter and heavier all at once, less lonely and more lonely at the same time, like some kind of paradox. He wondered what could have happened to cause it. The same day it had started, he'd also noticed a small amount of blood in the back of Naruto's bright blonde hair, which was concerning, but since he'd shown no signs of pain nor was any injury present, he assumed it was just pain from a prank he'd missed while showering. After all, for all that the villagers didn't like him, Iruka had never seen anyone get violent with him, and whenever they had spars in class they were always cleared by a medic. The biggest change, though, was in Naruto's in-class behavior. He stared, a lot, not into Iruka's eyes or anyone else's but lower on their face, which was odd. Odder still, was the fact that despite how Naruto seemed to be paying attention, he still couldn't answer questions or asked him to repeat things. He took notes on some things but not others, wrote down almost everything he'd put on the board, but there would be gaps in things he lectured. At first he'd chalked it up to Naruto's short attention span, but it now seemed to be something else. Getting his attention was difficult. In order to get any kind of reaction he had to raise his voice, and whenever he was behind him it was like Iruka stopped existing in the blonde's world. It was little more than a hypothesis, a theory, but it was something that should be explored since the likelihood that Naruto even knew what was wrong was slim. He knew the two other teachers he'd had weren't what anyone would call fair to him, so gaps in his knowledge were bound to exist, and the likelihood any of his students had been taught about this, even by their parents, was minimal at best. So during class on Monday, Iruka decided to try a different approach. He asked a question facing the blackboard, wiping something he'd written earlier off, and called on Naruto to answer. The blonde was looking at him, but didn't seem to register that he'd said anything at all. A boy sitting next to him elbowed Naruto harshly in the ribs. Iruka would have to have a talk with him about that. And the blonde's whisker-marked cheeks pinkened in embarrassment. What? He seemed almost scared to ask, likely worried Iruka would blow up on him for not listening. Instead he simply repeated the question, not letting anger or annoyance color his tone. Can you name a type of taijutsu? He changed the wording slightly, shortening it, and spoke louder. Naruto's face scrunched in thought, but it wasn't long before he tentatively answered the question. Kenjutsu? It wasn't one most of the class would have said. Most of them likely would have said shurikenjutsu, since it was a topic they worked on frequently both physically and on paper. Everyone seemed shocked, because not only was the blonde right, but he'd named one they didn't touch upon more than a couple times. The academy didn't even really teach it beyond a brief explanation of what it was and during the unit on Kiri when they discussed the 7 swordsmen of the mist. It was quiet enough to hear a pin drop, and Naruto was turning a deep red, ready to be made fun of or scolded for a wrong answer. Iruka smiled warmly at the blonde. Correct. He didn't think the blonde could ever grin brighter than when he'd smiled at Iruka in that moment. He wondered briefly how often Naruto actually smiled for real and how he could keep him smiling, because the smile he'd received simply by telling the blonde that he was right was 1,000,000 times better than any grin he'd ever seen Naruto wear. It was a start, Iruka knew. The simple test wasn't concrete proof, but it was a clue that he was at least heading in the right direction. The rest of class continued that way, and as did classes after that. Instead of getting angry with Naruto for not paying attention, he simply repeated the question and waited for Naruto's answer. Sometimes it was clear that the blonde didn't quite get it. The frequency was something that made Iruka write more about what he was talking about on the board, since he knew he'd talked about it before. But more often than not the whisker-marked boy did know the answer, and it was astonishing. Also astonishing was the fact that as time went on, Naruto got better at spars. He didn't let his opponent get behind him, and if they did manage to escape his line of sight, he got better at blocking the attacks. He didn't always win, but he was improving immensely, and Iruka had never felt more proud. Nearly 6 weeks into the change of pace in the classroom, something else had changed. Iruka had just ended class for the day and stopped Naruto before he made it out the door with a gentle hand on his shoulder to get his attention. We're still on for ramen tonight, right? I'll meet you in front of Hokage Tower at 6 like usual, yeah? He spoke clearly, over-enunciating the words to make it easier for Naruto to follow. He'd figured out weeks ago that Naruto's odd staring had been him reading lips, and since then made sure to speak as clearly as possible around the blonde. Naruto, like he always did, nodded eagerly. The day Naruto says no to ramen, Iruka knew. Heads would be rolling because the only time the boy's appetite had ever been anything but enormous was when he'd had a particularly rough day, because of the villagers or because of his classmates. He was planning on using the opportunity to finally confront the blonde on his recent epiphany and offer him extra tutoring for anything he missed in class, because no matter how much the changes both of them had made had undoubtedly helped Naruto improve, his grades were still the lowest, and with the graduation exam fast approaching in only 5 months, including a break that would last about 2 weeks and days off for regular faculty meetings, he wanted to do everything he could to help the blonde who'd become something like a younger brother to him. Even if a part of him wanted to keep Naruto away from everything and everyone that could ever cause him harm. When Iruka turned to pack up his desk, he startled to find someone still in the room. All the other students had left but Shikamaru, another student whose grades were more towards the bottom of the class, though more from laziness than from anything else, was standing in front of his desk looking at him patiently. He kept his voice from wavering as he calmed his heart honestly. Was he really so deep in thought that an academy student could get the drop on him? "What can I do for you, Shikamaru?" The brunette, no matter what his grades implied, was far from an idiot. In fact, Iruka suspected that his intellect was closer to his father's than anyone else, so he knew he wasn't asking for help on class material. "It's about Naruto," the pineapple-headed boy said it in the same lazy drawl he said everything else, but something about it was different and it had Iruka narrowing his eyes slightly. "What about him?" The words were said with the same tone he always used when talking to kids, but there was an edge to it this time. A warning most wouldn't be able to pick up on. Shikamaru was by no means a bad kid. For all the times he skipped class, he was one of the few people that didn't openly pick on Naruto, the others being the blonde's other skipping buddies Kiba and Choji. But even Kiba teased the blonde a little harshly from time to time, but Iruka couldn't help but be protective. He'd come to truly care about Naruto, and if he found out anyone hurt him or wanted to, he wouldn't be known as the gentle school teacher anymore. He may be only a chunin, but he was a damn good one. Besides, he could use the practice. It had, after all, been a while since he trained properly. The Nara put his hands up in surrender. "It's nothing bad, I'm just kinda worried and it's troublesome keeping it to myself. I figured since you're the closest to him I should go to you." Iruka nodded at the logic. Shikamaru was nothing if not observant, and packed away some papers to grade later. "So what is it?" "I think Naruto might be deaf." Iruka swore in the moment the Shikamaru had inherited, not only his father's looks and mind, and laziness, but also his mother's bluntness, because Nara Yoshino was one of the most terrifying women he'd ever met, and she'd never, in all the time he'd known her, sugar-coated anything. "I see." He didn't want to give too much away, even if the 11-year-old likely knew what he was thinking before he did. "What makes you think that?" He wanted to know if the Nara saw what he saw, and maybe he'd seen something more. "Well, Naruto looks like he pays attention a lot, but sometimes when people say things he doesn't get it. Whenever you speak while writing on the board his eyebrows twitch and he kinda gets this sad, frustrated look on his face, but then he writes down pretty much everything you write on the board." Shikamaru seemed to be on a roll and there was no stopping him. Apparently he had been holding all this in for a while. When people talk to him he looks at their mouths and not their eyes, and when someone comes up behind him he jumps even if that person is loud enough that the rest of the room knows they're coming. Iruka was impressed, because even though he also saw those things, it had taken him a while to figure out where the clues were pointing. Shikamaru wasn't done though. About 6 weeks ago, when you started just repeating questions instead of scolding him, he actually knew the answers, and a lot of what he doesn't know is stuff that you taught before he started writing everything down and paying more attention. Before that he kinda just looked resigned, like he'd given up on being able to do anything about it, especially after kids would laugh at him when he'd need something repeated and he got called out for not paying attention. It was true. While Iruka had scolded Naruto a lot for his supposed not paying attention, other kids seemed to follow suit and mock Naruto for what he had once assumed to just be the blonde's short attention span. While Naruto certainly did have a short attention span, he only ever really seemed bored whenever the subject switched to history on Konoha's founding and things of that nature. Iruka's cheeks pinked slightly in embarrassment because while he stopped yelling at the blonde when he asked for something to be repeated, his classmates didn't, though Naruto had definitely stopped caring as much about the opinions of his classmates. Iruka liked to think it was because he cared more about his opinion more than his peers, and that the boy liked Iruka for more than just the free ramen he provided, but he didn't tend to be that lucky. The boy didn't trust easily, and Iruka doubted that ramen was enough for the blonde to forget about the hatred he'd once looked at him with. So you noticed it too? Did you tell anyone else about this? Iruka was well aware of how cruel children could be, and if any of them found out before Naruto could properly protect himself, the Chunin worried about what could happen if he was caught off guard. Shikamaru shook his head. No, I've seen how the villagers treat him. I just thought you should know because you're the only one who really seems close to him. He's an orphan and he has no friends, so I thought if you knew, especially since you're a teacher, you'd be able to help him better. I can tell he's not stupid like everyone else thinks. It'd be troublesome if something like this prevented him from reaching his true potential. Iruka smiled warmly at the thinly veiled concern. As objective about the situation as he clearly wanted to sound, it was more than obvious to Iruka that Shikamaru did care about Naruto to some degree. I was planning on talking to him about it tonight. I've done all I can in the classroom, but nothing really seems like it's enough, especially since he doesn't have anyone to help him outside of the classroom. Iruka sighed, slinging his bag over his shoulder. Naive as he is, he really doesn't trust as easily as it seems, and I think friends outside of me would be good for him. He doesn't really get social cues, and his hearing doesn't seem to be the only factor. Did you know he's lived in an apartment on his own since he was 4? Clearly the boy did not. I know we don't really skip together anymore, but I wouldn't mind spending more time with him, troublesome as he is. He and Choji get along too, and Choji is always looking for someone to introduce new food to. Iruka might have heard a mumbled Naruto could definitely use a few more pounds too, skinny as he is, but if he did, he didn't comment on it. He agreed. I'll leave it to you, Shikamaru. He smiled warmly at the clan heir as he walked to the classroom door, waiting for his student to walk out before locking it behind him. As he made his way out of the academy, Iruka glanced at a clock. 3:45. Good. He had time to drop off his school papers and talk to the Hokage. He knew Naruto had an odd relationship with the man, referring to him with the disrespectful sobriquet Jiji, not that he seemed to mind, and he knew that despite the lack of free time that came with the title, Sandaime-sama did care about Naruto. He spent the walk to his apartment thinking about just what to say to the Hokage, what he could request that could help Naruto without tipping off the other kids before the blonde was ready for them to know. He decided, as he put his bag by the desk in his room, on simply telling the Hokage that he suspected Naruto had a disability and that he was planning on talking about it with him that night. Maybe after he talked to Naruto he could get the Hokage to let him teach shinobi sign language in class. If not, he had no issues teaching Naruto out of school. They'd end up learning it eventually anyway, at least partially. He nodded to himself and made his way to the Hokage tower. Iruka would make sure Naruto got the help he needed. And if Shikamaru spent the night thinking of ways he could inconspicuously weasel his way into Naruto's life, that was his business. The start of his meeting with the Hokage could have gone better, admittedly. Although he had no doubts that the Sarutobi knew of his bond with Naruto and that he'd never harm the blonde, he couldn't fault him for his worry. It only showed how soft the older man truly was for the boy, despite his lack of free time as village leader. I'm worried about Naruto. As soon as the words came out of his mouth, Iruka winced. Hiruzen's eyes narrowed at him, and immediately he was reminded of his encounter with Shikamaru before he'd left the academy. He corrected himself quickly. I'm worried for Naruto. I think something may be wrong. Before the wrinkled man could get the wrong idea again, he explained. Not with the seal or anything to do with it, but I think his troubles in school might go beyond a simple attention disorder. The Sandaime Hokage's dark eyes softened again and he gave the tanned Chunin an apologetic look. Iruka wasn't offended in the least. Naruto deserved to be cared for, and to have the most powerful man in the village looking out for him only went to show how magnetic the boy could be. What do you believe is the problem, Iruka? Hiruzen puffed on his pipe, eyes like steel, not in anger at the scarred Chunin, but in worry for the blonde. I think he may have issues with his hearing. Iruka cut straight to the point. The Hokage was worried about his surrogate grandson, and beating around the bush would only further agitate the god of shinobi. The brunette could see the older man stiffen slightly, and he waited for the news to process before continuing. He had no doubt that the Hokage, who'd shared many bowls of ramen with the blonde and even essentially camped out in woods with him when he was younger, would be angry with himself for not noticing sooner, for not being around more, much like Iruka. He seemed to droop a bit in his disappointment, His eyes closed in what seemed like remorse before he straightened himself out and steeled himself. What brought you to this conclusion? It was important, Iruka knew, that there was a legitimate reason to bring such a wild-sounding theory to the Hokage's attention. He told him everything. Iruka explained how, on a hunch, he'd simply repeated himself when Naruto asked instead of blowing up on him for not paying attention, and how the blonde had answered the question correctly. He told him about how, after continuing this, Naruto had not only shown that he did know more than his grades made it seem, but also that the gaps in his knowledge seemed to come from verbal lectures and not from anything they did that involved reading or practical application lessons. How he'd noticed that Naruto tended to stare at people's mouths instead of their eyes when they spoke, and how anything that left his direct field of vision seemed to disappear to him, and how cautious he was about anyone being behind him. Iruka also mentioned theories he'd had from the beginning about Naruto's earlier education being sabotaged in some way, and how much he's improved since Iruka changed the way he handled the blonde. Not to mention the confidence he'd been exhibiting since he'd started getting this right, and instead of getting yelled at for something that had been beyond his control. I don't think it'll affect his ability as a shinobi, though, and wasn't that curious, since Iruka had previously been worried that Naruto wasn't ready to be even a genin. The Hokage looked at him curiously. Why not? Though he knew there were certainly shinobi out there who lacked proper hearing, hearing such a thing from Iruka was almost shocking. Because I think the majority of his problems during practical lessons was based on his lack of self-confidence. He was constantly being laughed at by other students for every mistake he'd made before, and since I changed my teaching method with him, he's only improved. He sounded like a proud parent, he knew, but he couldn't help be proud of Naruto's progress. He's been winning more of his taijutsu spars recently, and even though he's still struggling a bit, he's at least figured out that the reason for that is because they managed to get behind him and has been trying to stop them before they managed to. He was especially proud because Iruka didn't tell him that was the problem. It was something he'd learned through experience and showed more than anything that Naruto did pay attention. Iruka's cheeks reddened as he listened to himself, his favoritism toward the whisker-marked boy made clear in his tone. Another student noticed, too. Nara Shikamaru came to me about it after class ended earlier today, and despite his grades also being on the bottom of the class, it's more from lack of any effort at all than from actually being wrong. He's a genius of only his father's caliber, I'm sure. He came to the same conclusion and voiced concern. Iruka grinned at the Hokage. He said he wanted to be his friend. Because clearly that was what was most important. Shikamaru had zero motivation for anything, but for some reason, perhaps Naruto's natural magnetism that seemed to draw anyone who gave him a chance in, he wanted to make an effort for him. Naruto, who'd never had a friend outside of the owners of Ichiraku Ramen, himself and the Hokage, deserved to have a friend his own age who was willing to make an effort for him. He had no doubt the pair could be great friends. Many of his other students, especially Sasuke, Kiba, Ino and Sakura, were still too immature and egocentric yet to truly begin to understand Naruto. The only other student who actually liked the blonde, as far as he knew, was too shy and underconfident herself to properly talk to him, which was unfortunate since they had plenty in common. The only others he could think of, Choji and Shino, while they perhaps don't have much in common with him, would no doubt be loyal friends if they gave the blonde a chance. He was glad to know someone saw the blonde for who he was and not what their parents told them he was or who they thought he was. What do you plan to do, Iruka? It seemed like a test, possibly to see how good a teacher he was, possibly to see just how far he was willing to go for the boy who'd become like a little brother or child to him. Actually, I was planning on talking to him tonight after our usual meal at Ichiraku. If he'll let me, I'd love to teach him sign language and offer him lesson notes so he doesn't miss anything. Honestly, if Gai-san didn't have a team of his own to worry about, I'd ask him if he had any tips for Naruto's taijutsu since the academy style doesn't fit what he needs. Eccentric as he is, I can't think of anyone better than him in taijutsu. I think they'd get along well too. Iruka trailed off, his mind filling with images of a green blur followed by a tiny orange one. He chuckled nervously, on second thought, maybe that wouldn't be a great idea. The Hokage did his best to stifle the laugh that threatened to escape at the idea of Naruto and Gai teaming up. With his protege Rock Lee as well. They'd make quite the trio, to say the least. On the contrary, I think taijutsu with Gai might be an excellent idea, given they don't spend too much time together. He definitely never needed to see Naruto's soft gold spikes cut into the shiny bowl shape the two taijutsu specialists sported or the orange-loving boy wearing a spandex suit like theirs in any color. I'll talk to him about tutoring Naruto a couple days a week, if that's something he'd be interested in, but I'm not sure even Naruto will be able to keep up guy. What about? Iruka hesitated slightly. What about teaching basic shinobi sign at the academy? Eventually any of them that actually become shinobi will need to learn it anyway, and if other kids in class knew, it could be easier for Naruto later. He'd already explained how he wanted as few people to know about it as possible, not only because it'd give the kids at school more fuel to bully him, but he didn't want the spread of the information to put him in danger. The villagers weren't kind to him, and if they thought they had an advantage as big as that, Iruka didn't want to think of the consequences. Naruto could tell who he wanted when he trusted them with the information. The only person other than the Hokage who would need to know without the blonde's permission would be his Jonin sensei after he graduates from the academy, since not knowing can put everyone else in danger. Bring Naruto here tomorrow afternoon, after the academy lets out for the day. I think it would be good to see him for more than a few minutes at a time to catch up. It's been months since we last had a chance to talk. Both men knew how vulnerable people finding out your weaknesses could make you feel, and both wanted to make sure Naruto knew he had both of their support. His hearing, or lack thereof, didn't make them think less of him. If anything, it was more impressive, especially given his improvement over the last few weeks. Nor was it too much of a hurdle in the way of his dream. After all, Hirazen's hearing nowadays wasn't the best either, but that didn't take away his ability. Iruka gave him a soft smile and a sharp nod. Of course, Hokage-sama. Overall, Iruka would say the discussion went well. When he and the Hokage parted, it was just in time to meet with Naruto, who was waiting where he always did. The blonde stood alone under a tree, out of sight from the villagers but where Iruka could easily find him. The tanned Chunin smiled warmly at Naruto, who grinned right back. Hey, Iruka-sensei, were you talking with Gigi? Is he still smoking? That's bad for him, ya know? The orange, living ball of energy seemed to be having a good day because his enthusiasm. The walk to the ramen bar was short and Naruto chattered the entire walk, but it was pleasant and felt more like family than either of them had before. Wasn't fake. His voice was still too loud for casual conversation, but it was quieter than usual, not as exaggerated, and the smile that accompanied it was real too. I did, but we'll talk about that later. I believe I promised you ramen, yeah? Let's head down to Ichiraku and you can tell me all about what's got you so excited. He wrapped his arm around the blonde's shoulders and walked with him close like he did every time they ate together. If the villagers had anything to say about him as they walked by, he had Iruka to lean on and to keep him distracted. There were no other customers at the ramen bar when the pair ducked under the awning, taking their seats on the stools. Large miso ramen with extra pork. Naruto called cheerfully to the man and his daughter who ran the joint. Tucci grinned at Naruto and got to work on Naruto's order while waiting for Iruka's, which, like always, was a simple salt-based ramen with a soft-boiled egg. Naruto frequently made remarks that miso was better, but Iruka only chuckled and said something about differing tastes. When the bowls were placed in front of them, the blonde was instantly inhaling the handmade noodles. It was a wonder how Naruto could claim it was his favorite when he was eating so fast Iruka wasn't even sure he could taste it at all. The brunette tapped the distracted blonde lightly on the shoulder, and he waited for his bright blue eyes to turn to him. When he had Naruto's attention, he spoke, making sure his words were distinct and clear but not speaking too loudly. What's got you so happy today, Naruto? Iruka gave the small boy a fond smile as he tucked into his own ramen. Oh, I learned something today. The blonde paused his slurping to give Iruka a bright grin. And what would that be? He certainly didn't learn anything new in class since the day had been review for an upcoming test and practice. If I do this, Naruto didn't outwardly do anything, his posture not changing in the slightest, but Iruka felt a burst of chakra emanate from the blonde. It wasn't disruptive to anything and no jutsu followed it, it was like an echo before it retreated. Then I can feel people. Sometimes I can tell who it is but mostly not, ya know. But that might be because I don't know many people though. I practiced a lot before coming here. Iruka was speechless. He was talking to the Hokage for 2 hours and before that he'd spent close to 40 minutes between talking to Shikamaru and dropping off his paperwork, and he practiced just releasing chakra the entire time. Any other academy student would have been beyond exhausted, It likely could have been a health hazard for someone so small and young. Though, thinking about it, it made sense. Naruto, in the couple years he'd been his teacher, seemed to have endless energy, and not once had he ever seen the boy anything but briefly out of breath after taijutsu spars. Iruka wondered briefly just how much chakra Naruto had and if it was the reason he tended to release so much when he was doing any of the basic jutsu. How long have you been practicing? Naruto's eyes squinted as he thought about it. Well, I only started practicing today. But I found out yesterday when I was trying to do a clone and it exploded. He said it like clones exploding was a normal occurrence for him. I don't know why I have so much trouble with them. Whenever I try, they come out like jelly. I tried using more chakra yesterday but then it blew up and I could feel everything. It was awesome, ya know? I was gonna try it during my spar today but I wasn't sure if it counted as a jutsu or not. If Naruto could hone that skill it could compensate for his hearing trouble, Iruka knew, and would likely prove to be more reliable than his ears. Wait, you can tell people apart? If his chakra pulses work like echolocation he shouldn't be able to tell anything specific except size. Naruto nodded enthusiastically, talking around a mouthful of noodles. You feel warm, but also like, flowy? It's kinda hard to explain. I guess it reminds me of warm water, ya know? Iruka did not, in fact, know. The Chunin was at a loss for words. How many people can you tell apart? Only you, Gigi, and a couple kids from class. Naruto shrugged like using his chakra in this way was just not done. Ever. Iruka dropped it for the moment. It was something to talk about after their meal when he brought up Naruto's hearing. The Chunin asked his student about how he felt he was doing so far and it was the first time the blonde had been happy to talk about his progress in class. His average was still low, after years of struggling to keep up it was to be expected, but his tests and homework as of late had been much better and it was clearly having a positive effect on Naruto. When he'd been studying for his certification he'd learned a bit of psychology, specifically learned helplessness. Where no matter what actions are taken, the result is never good, which causes the person to just stop trying. It reminded him of a phrase he'd often heard from Naruto, it doesn't matter anyway. Now that the blonde was seeing a positive change in his grades he seemed overall lighter, slightly more confident in himself in class. He was even putting more effort in because it was finally, getting him somewhere other than detention. Iruka felt guilty about that. Honestly, since Naruto's brand of learned helplessness was caused primarily by him not paying attention and was no real fault of Naruto's. The other students didn't help either and Iruka wondered when kids were taught that failure was somehow something terrible. It could be of course, but at this age there wasn't much they could do that would qualify. Why did it matter if someone got something right the first time or the 100th as long as they got it eventually? And even if they didn't, if they quit and tried something else instead, how could that be bad? Perhaps they'd grow out of it. Iruka hoped they did at least, since these would be close comrades after they graduate. After Naruto's customary 5 bowls of miso ramen and Iruka's 1 bowl they began walking back to the blonde's rundown apartment. Before Naruto could say good night and close his door, Iruka asked to come in for a moment. The conversation had to be somewhere that was Naruto's, somewhere the blonde would be comfortable. It would prevent some of the unnecessary stress this conversation would no doubt cause. Naruto looked at him strangely but allowed his teacher inside without protest and sat at his dining table. Iruka took the seat across from him. Naruto, I have a question for you and I want you to answer honestly, okay? He could see the blonde stiffen and he hoped he could relieve him of his tenseness as quickly as possible, but he had to know, and bluntness would always go over better with Naruto than beating around the bush. He was kind of oblivious. When the boy gave a timid nod, he gave a reassuring smile before getting to the point. Naruto, he spoke softly but deliberately and the sound completely lacked any emotion that could be considered negative. Do you have trouble hearing? He saw Naruto's blue eyes widen in realization that someone knew. He waited patiently for Naruto to answer him. He nodded again with a quiet, that Iruka wasn't completely sure Naruto was aware he made. Is that why you were struggling so much before? He, of course, already knew the answer, but Iruka felt that Naruto deserved this, to be the one to tell him. Naruto looked worried, nearly panicked, as he nodded once more and Iruka placed a gentle hand in the boy's blonde locks, smiling at him. I'm glad you were honest with me. I'm not angry, it's okay. His panic seemed to subside some. You know there are other ways to communicate besides talking, right? Naruto tilted his head. I know they exist but I don't know what they are. Writing on papers would work within the village but it could be dangerous on a mission and the blonde couldn't think of anything else off the top of his head. Have you ever heard of shinobi sign language? Naruto considered it for a moment but shook his head. He'd likely seen some shinobi around the village do something but didn't quite know what it was called. It's when you communicate with hand gestures. His hands moved as he spoke and Naruto assumed he'd translated what he'd said into his movements. Would you want to learn? There's two different ones. Konoha's shinobi sign, which is used during missions and is unique to Konoha, and then there's the general sign language that's essentially the same throughout the elemental nations. You would need to learn both. Naruto watched his hands move with rapt attention and he grinned up at Iruka. Show me. Iruka chuckled at the enthusiasm and took Naruto's dominant hand in his own. The brunette guided his first and second fingers over his thumb in a fist-like gesture. He moved his fingers again, making a loose almost fist out of his four fingers with his thumb laying against his pointer finger, facing up. Iruka continued, manipulating Naruto's hand into a peace sign, gently crossing his middle finger over his index finger. He uncrossed them, pushing the two fingers together. The teacher pushed them back down, resting his thumb against the second knuckle of his middle finger and placing his pointer over his thumb in another fist-like gesture. Finally, Iruka guided Naruto's hand into a C shape and pushed it close as if he were holding something invisible. Naruto was entranced the entire time, committing the gestures to his memory as they went through them a few more times. When Naruto could do it without Iruka helping him, he smiled warmly. Names are usually spelled and can take a while, so with people you're close to can be given a special sign as their name instead. Tomorrow I can get you some books if you'd be interested? Yes. Naruto cheered and Iruka couldn't remember the last time the boy was so excited over studying. They're kinda like hand signs for jutsu. I guess they are. Iruka chuckled because the only things that ever seemed to be on Naruto's mind had to do with being a ninja. When I spoke to Hokage-sama earlier, I warned him about my concern for you and he wants to see us both. Why don't we see if we can't convince him to let me teach the class sign, yeah? So you can get in as much practice as possible. Naruto looked nervous at the prospect of talking about his disability with the Hokage, but the prospect of learning something as interesting as ninjutsu that would help him was too great an opportunity to pass up. He nods with determination blazing in his blue eyes. Good, we're meeting with him after school tomorrow, okay? So get plenty of sleep. He gave Naruto a stern look that managed to look more caring than demanding, and Naruto nodded with a fond smile. He threw himself at Iruka, hugging the man tightly around the waist, and the brunette yelped at the sudden contact. Naruto didn't draw away. Thanks, Iruka-sensei. Naruto's voice was muffled by Iruka's vest where Naruto had pressed his face tight against the tan shinobi's stomach. Iruka smiled happily at Naruto, ruffling his hair. You're welcome, Naruto. Hiruzen, at first, had been worried Iruka was falling back into old habits regarding Naruto. Now, however, he was just worried about Naruto. If something was wrong and it took Iruka this long to notice, how was he supposed to notice when nowadays he only saw the boy after he pulled a particularly intense prank? He felt guilty because he should have seen something, anything, and taken care of it. Naruto, for all his bluster, was fragile no matter how much he fought to hide it, and he definitely did his best to hide his hearing problems. But maybe not. Maybe they'd all just been too blind to see what had been right in front of them. After all, how could a child who has never known any differently be able to tell the difference? Iruka would be there with Naruto in less than an hour, which would hopefully give him at least some answers. There was so little he could do about it too, since it would likely have been taken care of if it were due to sickness or injury by the fox, something that was discovered after seeing for himself how the small blonde's scraped knees heal themselves in seconds. That and the fact Naruto, as far as he knew at least, had never been sick. It would mean that Naruto had likely suffered from these hearing problems from birth and was something that doubtless had to say between the three of them, and the young Nara, for now. There was no telling how it would affect his classmates' already poor treatment of him, or the rest of the village's treatment of him. The Sandaime Hokage pushed the thoughts away. There was no use thinking about things that won't happen because revealing Naruto's disability to the village wouldn't happen, not without Naruto's express permission. It was a slow 53 minutes before the secretary came in saying Iruka was once again here to speak with him, Naruto in tow. When they walked in, Naruto beamed and shot toward him at top speed. "Hi, Gigi." Hiruzen chuckled. If he weren't an experienced shinobi, he likely would have missed the nervousness that poured off of the boy in waves. "Hello, Naruto." The Sarutobi turned toward the academy teacher who was waiting patiently to speak. "Go ahead, Iruka." The scarred Chunin shot Naruto a smile before reporting, more for Naruto's sake than the Hokage's. "Several weeks ago, during class, I called on Naruto to answer a question. He looked like he'd been paying attention, but when I asked him for the answer he asked me to repeat the question like he often does. Normally I would have just scolded him for not paying attention, but I was so sure that he had been. Instead of scolding him I simply repeated it a bit louder, and when he answered it he was right." Hiruzen listened to the extra detail in his explanation carefully, and Naruto seemed entranced by it. Apparently when Iruka spoke to him the night before he likely didn't explain how he figured it out. The blonde actually looked surprised by how closely Iruka had been paying attention. It would be sweet if it weren't so sad. "Over the last several weeks I began speaking a bit louder when I give lectures and writing more on the board to test my theory, and I'm sure you've noticed Naruto's grades steadily improving. The pieces just seemed to fall into place after that. Naruto's weakness in academics, how he startles when you come up behind him no matter how obvious you are about it, how he often asks for things to be repeated." Naruto was hiding his face as Iruka built up to the conclusion, though Hiruzen had a feeling he knew where this was going. "I was sure he had trouble hearing, and after our talk last night, we've discovered that he is, in fact, deaf." It was obvious Naruto didn't suffer from total hearing loss, at least, as he did seem to hear some things enough for no one to notice the problem to begin with. At first, Naruto started his own explanation shyly, and to the shock of both shinobi. They hadn't been expecting the blonde to be so forthcoming with information. "I just thought it was normal. I don't remember ever really hearing things super clearly, ya know? And everyone always yells at me in the village, so I just assumed they were always telling me to be quiet because they hate me. I still think it's part of it, but at the time all I knew was that if I spoke any quieter I wouldn't be able to hear myself, ya know?" Iruka looked a bit confused, and it was clear that it wasn't something he'd told the teacher during their talk. Both men had the same question in their minds. "How did you figure out your hearing was bad, then?" "Well, it makes sense, doesn't it? If everyone else in class can hear what Iruka-sensei teaches and I can't, or if people in the village are talking to each other and I can't hear them even though they can hear each other." There was definitely more to the story, but Naruto didn't seem to want to elaborate. "But Iruka-sensei said I could still be a ninja. With your permission, Hokage-sama, I'd like to teach basic shinobi sign language in class and give Naruto any extra tutoring he needs." They discussed this already, but Iruka felt the Hokage's response would only solidify the faith Naruto's put in both of them by being aware of his disability. "Do what you find necessary to make this as easy for Naruto as possible." The blonde's grin was blinding. "Naruto, there was one other thing Iruka and I talked about yesterday. There's a shinobi in the village named Maida Guy. He's a taijutsu expert, and we were wondering if you'd be interested in receiving extra tutoring from him. The academy style seems unfit given your situation, and I have no doubt he'd have plenty to teach you." Hiruzen could swear there were stars in Naruto's eyes. He'd known for a while that Naruto struggled with the academy style, occasionally observing the class during practices. He had no doubt Naruto's problems stemmed both from his natural unpredictability, whereas the academy-level taijutsu was simple and entirely predictable when you had experience, and because it relies so much on sight and sound. Guy would definitely have plenty of things to teach him, though he worried about the green-clad shinobi pushing Naruto too far. He was small for his age and would likely struggle with Guy's typical teaching methods, still the end result would be worth it if it helped him. Seeing Naruto's wary look, Iruka cut in. He and Hiruzen both knew Naruto struggled with new people, and while Guy had never had any issues with Naruto and his status as Jinchuriki, it was easy to see why he'd be concerned. "What if you met him first? To decide if you think it would be good for you?" Honestly, Iruka thought the two would get on well. He just hoped Naruto didn't start coming to class wearing spandex and sporting a bowl cut. "Would you be there?" It was quiet and a little slurred, but both men heard it and felt their hearts break just a little. Of course. Iruka sounded so sure that any doubt Hiruzen had ever had about Iruka's feelings about Naruto was gone. Naruto's smile was more genuine, than Hiruzen had ever seen before, and he couldn't help but return it. "I'll talk to Guy-san when he and his team come back to report." Thanks, Gigi. Naruto turned to Iruka, still smiling brightly. Can we get the books now? If Hiruzen had been anyone else he might have fallen out of his chair at hearing Naruto getting excited over books. Iruka looked at him for permission to be dismissed. Go ahead, he granted the silent request. Naruto, come back in a few days to show me your progress. We can get ramen, Naruto nodded, determined to learn as much as he could to impress the Sandaime, and skipped away with Iruka to a bookstore. It was nice, Hiruzen thought, that Naruto was so genuinely happy simply by having support. Naruto had been having the best few days of his life. Even if Sasuke Teme got the drop on him in their taijutsu spar the day before. He was doing better on his classwork and homework, kids weren't making fun of him nearly as much as they had before, and Iruka-sensei no longer yelled at him when he asked the man to repeat what he said. He never expected anyone to pay close enough attention to figure it out, never thought they'd ever care enough to try. But Iruka-sensei did. When Iruka first asked about his hearing he was nervous. He didn't know if the man would be mad at him for hiding it or try to make him stop trying to be a ninja or how the man would react at all. But he'd smiled at him and told him he'd help and it was everything Naruto ever wanted. The way Iruka-sensei maneuvered his hand into the letter signs for his name had reminded Naruto of the way he'd seen some shinobi parents teaching their kids hand signs for jutsu. The feeling of family, of not being alone stayed with him the whole night. Naruto had also been nervous about talking about it with Hokage Gigi, because if he decided it was too dangerous for him to become a ninja then everything he'd worked so hard for the last few years was for nothing. Hokage Gigi hadn't done what he'd expected either, much to Naruto's relief. The old man had looked proud of him, when he'd heard about the rise in his grades like Iruka-sensei had been when he handed back his papers. Naruto wondered if the fluttery feeling he felt every time he saw that look was what it felt like to have a family but pushed the thought away because he would not let that loneliness ruin his good mood. In any case, he wasn't completely lonely because he had Iruka-sensei and Gigi and they were all he needed. After promising to meet Sandaime Gigi again in a few days, Iruka-sensei took Naruto went to a few bookstores in Konoha, shinobi bookstores that had owners and employees who didn't send him out as soon as he stepped in or glare at him the entire time he was in the shops. The Chunin got him several books on shinobi sign language. Books on both basic and advanced grammar and vocabulary as well as a book on deaf culture and a book on that described ways around impaired senses on missions. He'd also asked for a large number of the basic sign books to be delivered to the academy by the following Monday. Naruto was ecstatic, because this was actually happening. He spent the entire evening practicing shinobi sign language with Iruka-sensei and was even able to work out sign names for him and Gigi and Iruka-sensei gave him one in return. Hokage Gigi's was the easiest. Just, grandfather, signed by taking his dominant hand, fingers splayed out, and touching his forehead with his thumb and bringing his hand forward in two small arches. Iruka-sensei's name sign came when they were reviewing shinobi vocabulary. The word, scar, signed across his nose with an I instead of his index finger. He explained that it was originally going to be dolphin, but decided it took too long to be a name which made Iruka-sensei laugh. The name Iruka-sensei had given him wasn't a word they'd gone over yet, but was fitting nonetheless. It was whiskers, signed by dragging out spread fingers across the cheeks and out. Naruto decided he liked it. Kurama had told him once that he had the strange marks on his cheeks because he'd been sealed inside his mother while she was pregnant with him and exposure to his chakra had caused them. They were a nice reminder that he was never alone because even if everyone else was gone he still had Kurama. Mentally he decided that Kurama's name sign would just be Fox, at least for the time being. He wasn't supposed to know about being his Jinchuriki yet and if anyone found out he'd been talking to the fox they might react badly so he wouldn't be able to mention him, but the thought was there. Besides, the sign was kind of cute which would no doubt annoy him. It was easy, just the sign for F and 9. A circle made with his index finger and thumb with his remaining fingers stretched up, over his nose and twisting by flexing his wrist a couple times. Iruka even cooked dinner for them both consisting of fried pork cutlets served with sauce and cabbage with miso soup, white rice, bean sprouts, pickled radish and cucumber, braised lotus root and rolled omelette. Naruto was so happy to be eating a homemade dinner with another person and not eating cup ramen no matter how delicious it was alone in his apartment he didn't even complain about all the vegetables. In fact, he ate all of them. In the end he decided that the bitter taste of vegetables was bearable as long as he wasn't eating alone. During class the following day, Iruka-sensei announced that at the beginning of the next week they'd be starting a unit on Shinobi Sign Language. Naruto was grinning but no one else seemed to share his excitement. That was okay, they just didn't understand how awesome it was to be able to communicate without making a sound. When they were given a few minutes break to talk to each other while Iruka-sensei graded papers, Naruto, like always, stayed in his seat. People tended to get angry if he tried to talk to them and he decided getting insulted and losing his good mood wasn't worth human interaction. The seat beside him was usually empty, so when someone carelessly flopped into it Naruto nearly fell out of his chair. He stared at the person with his hand over his pounding heart and breathed out a sigh of relief to see it was Shikamaru. In their earlier years at the academy they'd skipped together with Kiba and Choji, but nowadays Kiba was too good to skip with him. Not that he stopped skipping. Naruto was just no longer good enough a companion to skip with, and Shikamaru tended to be too lazy. Choji usually just followed Shikamaru. The fact that the Nara was now sitting next to him after declaring him too troublesome was beyond Naruto. Yo, he gave the blonde a lazy wave, laying his head over his arms on the desk. Naruto managed a confused, "Hi?" before cracking. "Why are you sitting here? Don't you normally talk with Choji during break?" It wasn't said sarcastically and Naruto knew Shikamaru knew that it was genuine confusion prompting the question. "I wanted to sit here. The breeze is nice," and that was the end of that. Shikamaru lifted his head and turned to face Naruto properly. "What do you think about us having to learn Shinobi Sign? You looked pretty excited during the announcement. It's so cool. It's like hand signs for jutsu. Only they mean words. You can have full conversations without saying a single thing. It's amazing, ya know?" He didn't go into too much detail. He didn't want to tip anyone off about why they were learning it, though Naruto knew it was more because Iruka-sensei wanted him to make friends than anything else. He didn't doubt that Shikamaru would be able to figure it out, though. Naruto learned a long time ago that the Nara heir was way smarter than he let on and that his grades weren't a good representation of his intelligence at all. "What about you? What do you think?" Naruto did his best to keep the conversation from falling into an awkward silence, even if it meant asking questions he could probably guess the answer to. It's troublesome to learn a new language, Naruto knew it. But I also think it's useful. The fact that even you think it's interesting says a lot, though, so it might be worth learning. Did Nara Shikamaru just imply that he was going to put actual effort into something because Naruto, Uzumaki Naruto, the class clown, thought it was interesting? Naruto brushed the thought away. There's no way that was what he meant. Knowing you, you'll probably learn it super fast and pretend you don't know it at all, ya know? He didn't mean to blurt it out like that, but it was true. You noticed that? The pineapple head sounded surprised and Naruto tried not to be offended. Just because he couldn't hear things didn't mean he couldn't see them, not that Shikamaru knew about that. He nodded shyly. Was he not supposed to have noticed? Naruto thought it was obvious. Troublesome? Things were silent for a few moments, but luckily it wasn't too awkward. When Shikamaru spoke again he changed the subject and the two ended up talking about Naruto's recent improvement in class. He was careful to avoid saying anything about his hearing, but happily talked about how things seemed to be going well and that the extra unit would give him another opportunity to bring his grade up just enough to no longer be the dead last. Hopefully. The break was over too soon and when lunch rolled around Shikamaru even brought Choji over with him to talk. It was nice not eating alone, even if he did have a lunch packed with leftovers from Iruka-sensei's homemade dinner. They talked about food and clouds in class and it might have been the best day of school he'd ever had. The only thing he could think of that could make it better would be finally beating Sasuke Teme in a spar. He was so caught up in talking to Shikamaru and Choji that he didn't notice the fond smile Iruka sent his way as he watched the trio. Things seemed to be looking up for Naruto. Both Iruka and the blonde himself hoped things stayed that way. It quickly became obvious, specifically with the changes Iruka-sensei had been making to his method of teaching, that something was wrong with Naruto. Another few days of observing had made that something clear. He didn't respond to quiet sound, had trouble understanding things people said when they spoke at normal levels or weren't facing him, and really only seemed to learn anything when he experienced it for himself or the teacher was being louder than what should have been necessary. Deafness was the obvious conclusion and time watching made it even more painstakingly clear to Shikamaru just what Naruto's problem was. It was also clear that Iruka-sensei had, at least, an inkling about it. He'd seemed just as surprised as everyone else when Naruto had gotten that first question right, but when he saw that whatever experiment he performed was successful, he kept at it. His classmates seemed confused about the whole thing. Writing more on the board, speaking louder, facing the class more, even the way Iruka-sensei was speaking was different, clearer. Shikamaru was disappointed to say that it took figuring out Naruto had a disability to make him finally take an initiative toward a real friendship with the blonde. Especially when he knew about the hardships Naruto suffered on a daily basis. Shikamaru knew before even doing anything, that no matter what, Naruto would be suspicious of his sudden change in attitude around him. Not that he'd ever bullied him or meant to be mean, but he remembered instances when they were young where he hadn't exactly been nice. No matter how naive the blonde seemed, no matter how idiotic he acted, it recently became more than clear that he was anything but. Before their academy teacher changed the way he taught regarding Naruto, Shikamaru would have never believed it. Now, though, it seemed that the way Naruto had been treated by everyone growing up may have affected more than just his emotional health. He was street smart and clearly read more than he liked to say. His ability to answer questions correctly truly was quite telling, especially when they were about things they didn't talk about much in class. Because while Naruto certainly did skip school and sleep during class occasionally, he had always done it in a way that suggested resignation more than it did stupidity or carelessness. It seemed like he expected to always be wrong no matter how simple the concept or question. When you took into account his trouble focused on hearing the questions, it made a lot more sense. At least, it did when you paid attention. He kept the hypothesis about Naruto's potential deafness to himself for weeks before it became too troublesome. His brain was taken over by thoughts regarding the blonde's entire situation, interfering with his normal minimal functioning days. He knew telling Ino was a terrible idea. The rumor would spread like wildfire and Naruto would once again be the laughingstock of the class. Actually, telling almost anyone would have been a terrible idea. They all disliked the kid way too much for them to ever understand. Choji was a possibility, but he might tell Ino, and Shikamaru wasn't close enough to anyone else. He ended up settling on confiding in Iruka-sensei. At least then, if he didn't already know, he'd be able to help Naruto more than he'd be able to. When he finally spoke to Iruka about his suspicions on Naruto's hearing impairment, it turned out he had missed something important. Iruka-sensei clearly had shared his suspicions but, in his ramblings, had let something slip. Shikamaru had always assumed that since he was a minor and was never adopted, Naruto had lived at the orphanage for most of his life, or with someone at the very least, even if he had thought that whomever was taking care of him neglected him. Finding out that Naruto had been living alone since he was a toddler hurt, because Naruto really never had anything at all. It was enough to make Shikamaru grateful for his troublesome parents, especially his mother and his clan. More than anything, it explained a lot about Naruto he'd overlooked. His height and weight, both too low for his age, likely came from his improper diet and lack of money. Naruto's love of ramen made sense too. Ramen, whether it came from a stand or a cup, was cheap and filling, not to mention the fact that he'd never had anyone teach him what a proper diet consisted of. He mumbled to himself about it, how Naruto was too skinny. He wasn't sure if the academy teacher caught it, but decided that the man was likely to agree with him anyway. The whole interaction only made Shikamaru want to help Naruto more. It was an odd feeling, to not want to just sit around while someone else did all the heavy lifting, but actually be the one to do it. It was unlikely anyone else would, and if they did, it wasn't likely they'd be able to appreciate everything the blonde had gone through. For reasons not even Shikamaru understood, he wanted to ease the blonde's burden, even just a little. Images flashed through his head of times he'd seen Naruto truly sad or hurt, and the few times he'd been truly happy. He almost never showed his real emotions, the Nara heir realized. Everything was a mask, like when he'd play off his failures as a joke and laugh, but when he thought no one was looking he'd look so sad. Or when he was looked at with what the blonde referred to as, those eyes, and when parents would pick their children up and he was left alone. The only times he can remember Naruto's smiles ever being genuine was when he and Choji played with him that one day, and when he had ramen with Iruka-sensei, whose favoritism toward Naruto came seemingly out of nowhere. The grins he wore during class or when he played pranks were so fake they were almost painful to look at. There was something else too. He couldn't remember why or who or even what was happening, but he could clearly see himself, Choji and Ino and Sakura glaring at him. The pink had accused him of something. It was something stupid, but he couldn't remember what it was. He could recall the sadness and anger in Naruto's eyes and voice when he responded though. Something about defending an outsider, what did that even mean? But still looking at him with those eyes. More than anything, he remembered truly believing whatever Sakura had accused Naruto of. He remembered feeling some kind of gratification from seeing Naruto sad about it, like somehow he'd done something to warrant that kind of treatment, that the blonde was just too stupid to understand that it was all his fault. He was young, and of course that could be his excuse, but it didn't feel like a stable one. It didn't justify treating someone so small and alone in such a way. The memory didn't make any sense to Shikamaru. He'd asked Ino and Choji about it before, and neither of them remembered anything similar, so it was possible it was just a dream. The Nara didn't believe it though. For a long time those shards of memory were one of the main reasons he stayed away from Naruto. On the off chance the blonde remembered and hated him for it, though the way he behaves around Sakura suggests the contrary, Shikamaru suspected that was fake, or mostly fake as well. He thought it would make everything troublesome. After hours of attempting to think of ways to befriend Naruto and drawing blanks, he went to his father. The Jonin commander had decades more experience dealing with people than Shikamaru, and a much higher IQ, though he was steadily catching up, and the clan heir had no doubt that the man would have something helpful. It ended up being just as vague as ever, and this time Shikamaru couldn't tell if it was because his father wanted him to learn on his own, because he really didn't know how to approach it, or because of something else entirely. The conversation had started well enough. The Nara clan had told him to tread carefully and not to act too familiar too quickly, which was useful. Then he got vague, mostly about Naruto's situation in regards to the village. The burden he carries is more than you or I could ever understand, his father had told him. What burden? The hatred of the village or the reason for it? Shikamaru wasn't sure. He wasn't sure he wanted to know either. In the end he decided to pretend that anything he did, no matter how out of character it seemed, he'd just pretend it wasn't. Shikamaru knew that Naruto tended to respond to situations based on emotions. If he acted awkward about talking to the blonde, then Naruto would be awkward back and he'd never get anywhere with him. Iruka gave him the opportunity 2 days later when he announced to the class that they'd be starting a unit on Shinobi Sign Language. It also served as a confirmation of his theory, since there was no doubt he needed Hokage approval to change the curriculum. Naruto, compared to everyone else's gloom about hearing the news, was practically glowing with happiness. It presented the perfect opportunity. During the short break they'd been given to talk, he stood up and plopped himself into the empty chair beside the blonde. Naruto jumped, startled by the sudden action, but Shikamaru kept his face neutral. There was nothing abnormal about any of it, no reason to be awkward. Yo, he drawled out a lazy greeting. Laying his head on the desk, he made sure Naruto could see his mouth and hoped the angle wouldn't be too much of a problem. Hi? It was worded as a question, and it was clear that Naruto was confused by the whole thing. Why are you sitting here? Don't you normally talk with Choji during break? The blunt questions reminded him of Iruka-sensei's comment from 2 days before about Naruto not entirely understanding social cues. Most people would ask such things in a much less straightforward manner, but it was okay. Shikamaru didn't let the atmosphere become awkward and continued as if everything was normal. I wanted to sit here. The breeze is nice. There was actually virtually no breeze since the windows were on the other side of the classroom, but Naruto didn't need to know that. He lifted his head and looked at the blonde. What do you think about us having to learn Shinobi Sign? You looked pretty excited during the announcement. It was a simple enough way to start a conversation, and the tension faded slightly as the blonde adjusted to the situation. It's so cool. It's like hand signs for jutsu. Only they mean words. You can have full conversations without saying a single thing. It's amazing, ya know? He noticed Naruto didn't mention anything about his hearing and knew their teacher hadn't told the blonde he knew. What about you? What do you think? It's troublesome to learn a new language. He knew the blonde was expecting it, but shocked the blonde by continuing. But I also think it's useful. The fact that even you think it's interesting says a lot, though, so it might be worth learning. He didn't mention that he was probably going to learn anyway, either to help Naruto or because, as shinobi, they would eventually need to learn some of it anyway. Naruto blinked as he processed what Shikamaru's words implied before pretending it didn't happen. Knowing you, you'll probably learn it super fast and pretend you don't know it at all, ya know? It was obvious Naruto hadn't meant to blurt it out the way he had, but Shikamaru was more surprised that he actually noticed. Few others did, and the only reason Iruka-sensei knew was because of a talk he'd had with his parents. You noticed that? Naruto's face did a weird thing and he seemed to tense again before nodding shyly. Shikamaru cursed himself. The blonde no doubt assumed he thought he was an idiot, now. Troublesome? The Nara changed the subject, easily distracting the blonde by complimenting his improvement in class. Naruto had to ask Shikamaru to repeat some things a few times, but other than that the conversation flowed smoothly until the break ended. During lunch he went over to the blonde again, this time with Choji. He knew the two of them would get along, even if Naruto tended to act a bit too over the top for the Akamichi most of the time. Especially since most of it was bluster, anyway. When they sat down, Shikamaru was surprised to see Naruto with a real lunch for once, but knew immediately Iruka-sensei had something to do with it. The Chunin totally mom-ed the kid, and if he were anyone else he'd say it was adorable instead of troublesome. Naruto deserved to have someone parenting him, though, especially since he'd been living on his own for so long. Seriously, what the hell? It was also lucky that his childhood friend tended not to talk too much, because Naruto had a very hard time understanding what he was saying, especially while Choji had food in his mouth. They talked about sign language and food and clouds and grades, and it was almost normal. Like they always hung out together, and Shikamaru was proud that nothing was awkward. Naruto even looked happy. Truly happy. It was a good look on him. Sasuke should take lessons. Choji shared his potato chips with the blonde and, even though he was shy and reluctant, Naruto had taken some. Neither clan heir was happy with how convinced their youngest male classmate was that he was burdening them when Shikamaru and Choji had chosen to sit with him. It was sad, and while Shikamaru had guessed it would be the case, Choji clearly hadn't expected it. The heavy-set boy contained his anger well, but it was clear that he'd expected Naruto to be as he made himself out to be. It was Choji who asked if Naruto would mind them sitting with him again. The blonde was still hesitant, still didn't trust them, but agreed. The pair of childhood friends hoped that he'd grow to be less hesitant in the future. Over the next few days they started sitting together during lunch and watched clouds while they waited for their turn to spar. It was nice, and, not for the first time, Shikamaru wondered how anyone could hate someone as genuinely nice as Naruto. Overall, Shikamaru thought it had been a good start to becoming friends. Before Monday rolled around, Shikamaru had purchased a number of shinobi sign language books and began studying. Eventually he'd have to learn it anyway, so really he was only saving himself the time by getting it out of the way. If it happened to be something that also helped Naruto, it was purely a coincidence. If, by the time they started lessons, he already knew nearly the entire beginner book and was almost ready to start the advanced one that was no one's business but Shikamaru's. Since their interaction a few days before, Hiruzen had been keeping an eye on Naruto. His disability made his life dangerous, and if anyone found out before he could defend himself, it could be a disaster. That was part of it, anyway. The larger part was the Sandame's concern regarding how his hearing affected his social life. He knew, before finding out about the boy's deafness, that Naruto had trouble understanding and reacting appropriately to social cues. He was blunt, not always a bad thing, but didn't help him much, and didn't have much of a filter. He said things as they came to mind, and most people regarded him as an idiot because of it, and when he did think things through it was considered a fluke. The boy Iruka had mentioned, Shikaku's son, seemed to see through it all. Shikamaru saw through the barriers Naruto put up, through the mask he wore to protect himself, and saw him. It was rare these days, Hiruzen thought, for children so young to be so insightful. The fact that he was willing to even talk to Naruto like an equal was quite the feat. It was sad how the village had become so mindless in their hatred that a child as pure as Naruto had been hurt. Sadder still how the generations following the attack followed their lead instead of drawing their own conclusions. It made Shikamaru's case special. No one told him to spend time with Naruto or to respect him, but he did. He saw what so many others chose to ignore, and the Sarutobi was grateful for it. Naruto deserved a friend who would appreciate him and not use him. He even caught the clan heir buying books on shinobi sign. He knew Shikamaru would be an excellent friend for Naruto, just as he'd been to the Akamichi heir who was also bullied. His own sign language was rusty. It had been years since he'd used anything other than basic Anbu gestures, and refreshing his knowledge had been a nice change of pace. Paperwork was well past boring, and Naruto would need him to actually understand when he came to show the Hokage what he learned over the last few days. He hadn't expected much, some simple phrases and interesting, probably ramen-related, vocabulary perhaps, but Naruto surprised him. When the blonde came bouncing into his office, the academy had just let out and he was beaming. "Gigi, I have so much to tell you." It was nice to see Naruto so genuinely happy when he was always so sad. "Naruto," the boy bounded to the extra chair and sat down, still twitching with excitement. "How have you been adjusting?" Naruto had been learning sign for only about 4 days, and his class would only begin teaching it after the weekend, so he hadn't expected the blonde to try to sign as he spoke. Shikamaru and Choji. He dragged out the syllables as he spelled them out and spoke slowly as he tried to remember the signs. "Have been sitting with me at lunch since Wednesday. They've been nice to me and don't treat me like the others do." His sentences were short and choppy, and his hand movements were the opposite of smooth, but he got all the signs right. It was more than clear that the boy had been studying hard with Iruka and had picked up sign quickly. "Iruka-sensei and I made sign names for some of my classmates and each other, and I made one for you." His wasn't exactly a name sign, but Naruto signing grandfather warmed his heart a little. It was nice to know that despite the many arguments they'd had, most of them heavy with emotion, Naruto looked at him like family. "What name sign did you give to Iruka? What did he give to you?" He signed the question back slowly as he said it. They would worry about Naruto's speed when he had more practice. He grinned even wider as he signed. "This is Iruka-sensei's." It was scar across his nose with the hand sign. "And Iruka gave me this." He signed whiskers across his whisker marks and pouted slightly. Hiruzen couldn't help but laugh. "You're progressing well, Naruto. Keep up the good work." Naruto lit up at the praise, at the confirmation that he was good and not a failure. "So tell me more about Shikamaru and Choji, then. Are you friends now, then?" "I think so. I'm not sure. They're nice to me, but I don't really know much about them yet. Shikamaru is really smart and really lazy, and Choji is motivated by food, and they've been friends for a long time." The blonde squinted his eyes in thought. "Choji offered to share his potato chips with me, and I'm kinda worried he's only doing it so I don't feel left out when he shares with Shikamaru, ya know." "Did you tell them that?" Knowing Naruto, he did, and, if there was any hope for the two boys, they reacted in a way the blonde didn't understand because of the way he'd been treated by others for so long. Naruto nodded. "I think they were angry? But it wasn't at me. I don't get it." Hiruzen was proud to be right. He was also proud that the boys saw the behavior for what it was, a giant red flag about Naruto's self-esteem. He knew that Naruto overplayed the cockiness he displayed in front of others to protect himself. If others knew his self-confidence was as low as it was, they'd use it as a target, and Naruto was nothing if not good at hiding his weak points. At least emotionally, though he was doing better in class. "Oh, Naruto, I spoke to Maeda Guy about tutoring you in taijutsu. He said he'd be willing to do so any days you wish for a few hours per day. That is, if you still want to after meeting him." Naruto was still worried about being targeted, about getting that look, and it was disappointing that the village brought him to such a point. A place, mentally, when he barely trusted that he wasn't going to be used, or glared at, or hurt. He gave the blonde a small smile. "He's a good man, Naruto. He's not one to discriminate, either. Did you know one of his students, Rock Lee, a genin from last year's graduating class, can't use chakra?" Naruto's eyes were wide, but he didn't laugh like so many others did. Though bad at the cloning technique, the blonde was quite adept at transformations and kawarimi, and it was good to see that he wasn't one to make fun of Lee's inability to do so. He looked to be in awe, actually. He makes up for it by being exceptional at taijutsu. Both train vigorously, so don't worry about keeping up with them, and if you do train with them, make sure you eat more than just ramen. Hiruzen chuckled. "Guy will work you to the bone, and you don't need to be losing any weight. You're already too small." Naruto grumbled to himself, pouting. "You sound like Iruka-sensei. He's been making me lunches for class. He also makes me dinner when we practice shinobi sign language." He said I need to put more meat on my bones and lectured me on how important it was to maintain a healthy weight as a ninja and how eating more vegetables would make me taller. Naruto didn't sound like he enjoyed eating vegetables, but if it was helping him eat more balanced meals, he'd allow Iruka to do what he needed. It's good that you're eating better, Naruto. You're the smallest member of your class. Considerably so. It could make shinobi training particularly stressful on your body if you don't eat right. Mentioning how it could affect his ninja career had been the best way to motivate the blonde for years, and it worked like a charm. Anyo, before recently I'd never had a home-cooked meal like that. It's nice, ya know? Not being alone for once. Naruto's cheeks were pink and he didn't even sound bitter about it. The boy truly was too good for all of them. Hiruzen had no doubt that hearing Naruto's sincere gratitude would brighten the Chunin's whole year if he told him. The Sandaime was about to tell him that when his office door opened and saw a familiar face burst through it. Gigi, get ready to fight. I'm going to be Godem Hokage. The tiny brunette charged him, but barely made it a step before he tripped on his long blue scarf and landed flat on his face. Hiruzen grumbled to himself as Konohamaru slowly got to his feet. Is this a trap? He asked himself as he rubbed his aching nose, and yet another familiar face appeared in Hiruzen's office doorway. Ebisu, a special Junin and his grandson's tutor. Are you okay, honorable grandson? May I just inform you that there aren't any traps here? He adjusted his sunglasses as he trailed off, waiting for some kind of response from Hiruzen's grandson. Naruto twitched as he watched the brunette boy, and eventually both he and Ebisu noticed the blonde. Naruto, thankfully, didn't notice the look that Tokubetsu Junin was giving him. His grandson, on the other hand, rather than taking Ebisu's subtle approach, walked right up to the blonde and stuck a pale finger in his face. You must have done this to me. Naruto lashed out, less angry than he was affronted. He grabbed the Hokage's grandson by his bright blue scarf. You tripped all by yourself, stupid. His fist shook as he prepared to literally knock some sense into the younger boy. Hey, let go of him. He's Hokage-sama's honorable grandson. Ebisu yelled at Naruto, and the blonde raised an eyebrow. Looking at the pair, Hiruzen could easily see how alike they were. They'd likely get along well, much to Ebisu's horror. It could be good for both of them, or it could turn into his own worst nightmare. Time would tell. The young Sarutobi scoffed and taunted the blonde. What's the matter? Weren't you gonna hit me? Can't do it 'cause I'm the Hokage's grandson, huh? If it hadn't been obvious the two had never met before, it certainly was now. Challenging Naruto would never end well for you, especially when it came to a fight. No matter how low his self-esteem, he'd never turn down a fight. After the 8-year-old's display, he was likely feeling pretty confident in his odds too. As if I care, moron. He clocked Konohamaru in the head, sending him back to the floor. Ebisu watched in horror, and the Hokage sighed. He'd hoped he would have gotten more time to catch up with Naruto, but there was no way the boy would be as open after this. He'd have to find him later. Naruto signed a quick but sincere apology as he left, and with the blonde gone, Ebisu scolded his grandson, warning him away from him. The youngest Sarutobi didn't stick around to listen and went to find Naruto instead, apparently impressed. Konohamaru followed behind the blonde, being what he considered sneaky. The older boy wasn't fooled and called him out before he could get far. Did you need something? His voice held annoyance, but it didn't perturb the future Godem. So, you found me, huh? He laughed, not noticing the blonde's twitching eyebrow. Your reputation is well earned. I will allow you to make me your apprentice. Huh? He barely registered the blonde's confusion. But first you must teach me the jutsu you were about to do before I came in. You were using unfamiliar hand signs. Both of you were. He squealed with excitement and didn't notice his new teacher's struggle with understanding everything he was saying. Well, actually those aren't. Konohamaru didn't care to listen. I beg you to say yes, boss. That made the blonde pause. He'd never been given that level of respect. His face pinkened. Boss? 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 He chanted it, hoping the older boy would agree. He rubbed the back of his hair sheepishly. I guess I have no choice then. His new boss led him out of the village center and to a less populated area near a training field and sat across from him. Look, it's not whatever you think it is. He considered something for a moment, squinting his eyes until he came to a decision. What I'm going to tell you is top secret, okay? You can't tell anyone without my permission. The only people you're allowed to talk to about it are your grandfather and Iruka-sensei. He didn't know who Haruka-sensei was, but since Naruto was older he assumed it was a teacher for one of the higher grades. The idea of being let in on an actual secret was exciting, and the blonde was serious, so instead of expressing that excitement, like he so desperately wanted to, he gave a firm nod. He would take this secret to his grave. First of all, the gestures you saw were something called shinobi sign language. Basically, it's a way to talk without words, understand? The brunette tilted his head. But you were talking loudly. Naruto laughed sheepishly. I only started learning a few days ago, so I don't know a whole lot yet. Saying it out loud helps me remember the signs. I was being loud because this is the part you can't tell anyone, okay? He waited for the nod to keep going. I was speaking loudly because I can't hear well. I'm deaf and the only way I can hear myself is if I'm loud. But you can't tell anyone because it could be dangerous. Konohamaru didn't understand how, but he'd trust his boss. It was top secret and he gave his word to keep it secret. He wouldn't let Naruto down. Will you still teach me? If he could learn, then they could communicate better. Then when he tried to drag real techniques out of him, he could teach him properly. Naruto looked surprised. You still want to learn? Teach me, boss. Then we'll start with the alphabet. The blonde declared, pulling out a sheet of folded paper with hands drawn on it. You're going to learn how to spell with your hands. They practiced for what felt like hours, and when they finally took a break, Konohamaru could spell his and Naruto's given names, others too, but those were the ones he was best at and his fingers were sore. The blonde had forced him to work on it until he could spell faster and with both hands. The brunette's fingers disagreed with his decision. When they stopped, his new boss bought them drinks from a machine and they sat down on a log facing each other to enjoy the rest of the day. You know, I've been wondering, why are you so obsessed with beating your grandfather? The question served as a reminder that he hadn't yet told the blonde his name. My name is Konohamaru and Grandpa is the one who gave me that name. He named me after the village and it should be easy for everyone to remember. He tried to speak clearly and loud enough for the blonde to hear. But no one ever calls me by my name. When they look at me, all they see is the grandson of the Hokage. No one sees me for who I really am and I can't stand it. That's why I want the title of Hokage now. The look in the blonde's eyes was something like understanding, and Konohamaru didn't know how he possibly could. Part of him hoped the older boy did understand, the rest wondered how he ever could. Idiot, who do you think will accept you, huh? It wasn't cruel and it sounded unfinished. You won't win the title that easily, you know. What? Konohamaru stood, fists raised, his offense clear to even someone who was deaf. The blonde didn't take the bait. It's not that simple. If you're really serious about gaining the title of Hokage. What? The older boy smirked, flashing sharp canines and burning blue eyes. You'll have to beat me first. The tenseness in the atmosphere faded and they returned to their drinks, nearly choking when a voice called from behind them. I found you. Ebisu-sensei was sitting on a tree branch, glowering down at his new friend, and the something Konohamaru didn't understand changed in his blue eyes. The fire that was burning behind them dimmed and he looked torn between anger and sadness. Honorable grandson, we had to go now. His voice was oddly calm, but there was an edge to it that Konohamaru couldn't explain. He shook his head. No way. I want to beat Gigi right now so I can win the title of Hokage. Don't get in my way. His tutor smirked at him. A Hokage must first know about virtue, honor, etiquette, wisdom, loyalty, faith, judgment and obedience. He must be skilled at more than 1,000 techniques. Stick with me, the distinct special Junin Ebisu, and you will gain a short towards becoming Godem Hokage. Konohamaru and his teacher played something akin to tug of war as the man tried to drag him away from the blonde. Come on, let's go. Konohamaru fought hard. No way. Henge. The pair stopped in their tracks as Naruto was engulfed in a puff of smoke. When it cleared, the blonde boy was gone and in his place stood a blonde woman with long hair pulled into pigtails. Thin clouds of white smoke barely covered her bare, tan skin and Konohamaru could see his teacher turning red. She put her hands on his shoulder, resting her face on them, and pressed her chest against his arm. Ebisu-sama, she breathed his name in his ear in something caught between a moan and a whisper, and the man was done for. He shot back, blood pouring from his nose. The special Junin twitched as he attempted to recover from the blow. With a puff of smoke, the woman was once again Naruto and he wore a grin a mile wide. I call it my Oiroke no Jutsu. He laughed at the effect it had on the distinct special Junin. Konohamaru begged the blonde to teach him the technique, but Naruto claimed he wasn't finished with it yet. But it beat my four-eyed teacher. He argued for the 5th time. I want the title of Hokage so badly. I want to be recognized by everybody. Finally the blonde gave in. I'll tell you what, in a few months I have my genin exam. When I'm an official ninja, I'll teach you. For now let's stick to sign. It's kinda hard to understand you when you talk. Konohamaru looked affronted but agreed, but Naruto wasn't finished. Do you think it's that easy to be accepted? To become Hokage? It's given only to the greatest ninja in the village. Everybody must learn to believe in you. I've been through a lot already. It's been one struggle after another. But after all that I found people who accept me. I had to go through a lot, just for 2 people. You'd better push yourself. For what? The path to getting the title of Hokage is a brutal one. The sun was setting and the wind blew loudly. Naruto grinned at him. There's no such thing as a shortcut. Konohamaru remembered what the blonde said earlier about beating him and pouted. Who do you think you are lecturing me like that? I've decided, from now on you're my rival. Naruto laughed brightly and Konohamaru scowled. What? We can be rivals when we're both real ninja, okay? Konohamaru could accept that. After all, you couldn't be Hokage until then anyway. He smiled at the blonde. Okay, Naruto Nichin. Within his seal, Kurama watched how his host handled the honorable flesh puppet and could help but feel proud. He wondered how he would have handled it if things had been different, but pushed the thoughts from his mind. It didn't matter how they'd be different because it wouldn't change the fact that he was stuck in a child. Even if the kid wasn't nearly as bad as he'd thought. Naruto's progress in shinobi sign language was surprising. He'd thought the kid, even ignoring his issues hearing, was an idiot and, yes, in some ways he was. But in other ways he was wise beyond his years and more observant than most others his age. It was sad that such potential could be squandered because of human foolishness. To make up for it, they spent a few nights a week going over anything Kurama could think of to make up for a punishment that wasn't even intended for the boy but for him. All the hardships Naruto faced were because he'd been sealed within him, and the blonde wasn't even mad. It was one of the few things Kurama could respect him for besides his mental strength. As low as his self-esteem may be, many others would have broken under the hatred of so many, and despite that he was still able to smile and live. The brat made it particularly hard to hate him after making an impression like that. He was fearless in the face of true danger but terrified of people, and it was disgusting. Because no matter how much he may or may not like his current host, it was completely irrelevant, he still hated humans. How they hurt and killed each other so needlessly. How they hated each other for the smallest differences. It was another one of Naruto's impossible goals. To end that hatred. Perhaps his reasons were selfish, but it was a selfless goal if Kurama had ever heard one, and it reminded him, painfully so, of his father. Of both of their fathers, really. Naruto didn't need to know that yet, though. The brat still had a long way to go, not only with becoming a respectable shinobi, but with earning even the respect of his peers. The Nara brat seemed to know more than he was letting on, and his Jinchuriki already suspected that if he didn't know already, he'd piece it together. Kurama didn't doubt it. If the Nara clan was known for anything besides their laziness, it was their brains, though none seemed to compare to the clan heads and his sons. If anyone was going to help Naruto realize his goals, it would be him. The Nara was already miles ahead of their peers. If he had access to his physical form, and the village wasn't likely to try to destroy him, even if they'd failed, Kurama would threaten him. Naruto dealt with too much pain in his short life, more than some seasoned shinobi, for a brat barely older to ruin the little happiness he'd found. He'd never admit it, though, not even to the brat he was sealed within. Time passed quickly for Naruto, but not quick enough. Training with Guy Sensei had been interesting. It was likely he'd have to stop when he graduated in a few months, but he enjoyed it. Meeting the green beast of Konoha had been odd, to say the least, but he never needed to ask either him nor his protege, Rock Lee, to repeat themselves. Ever. When Iruka Sensei introduced them, he hid behind the Chunin's legs. It wasn't something he'd ever tell anyone, nor was he proud, but it had happened. Some people didn't immediately recognize his name, but everyone knew his face. The distinct whisker marks were a dead giveaway, and most people didn't react well when they realized who he was. He'd been worried the always grinning man would stop grinning as soon as his dark eyes fell on him. He didn't. If anything, his grin widened, and it was a completely new experience because people, even the ones that liked him, hadn't looked that happy to see him when they first met. Lee was like a younger clone of the Jonin. With the exception of his eye shape and long lashes, they looked exactly the same, complete with huge eyebrows and shiny, black bowl haircut. He'd thought they were related, but apparently Lee had just wanted to emulate the man completely. Kurama threatened to eat him if he even considered wearing the spandex suit they'd offered. He didn't believe him, but he agreed anyway. Lee was also one of the nicest, most accepting people he'd ever met in his life. Because he couldn't use ninjutsu, the fact that Naruto struggled so much with clones and taijutsu barely fazed him and offered to practice with him when Guy-sensei was on missions. The man was a slave driver and Lee wasn't much better, but his stamina increased, and even though he couldn't beat Lee yet in hand-to-hand, he was still well beyond what was expected of academy students. Iruka-sensei had been proud, and secretly grateful the blonde hadn't been infected. Guy-sensei's other students hadn't been happy that another ball of energy, in an even more obnoxious color, was training with their team, but Tenten was nice, even if Neji was an arrogant bastard the likes of which rivaled Sasuke. With them he was able to learn a style of taijutsu that relied less on his ability to hear or even see his opponent, and with the weight training he'd been tricked into he was fast. Tenten had even helped with his bukajutsu a little while Neji grumbled about academy students fated to fail. He was nowhere close to being as dedicated or skilled as either taijutsu master, but he was good. Good enough that other kids accused him of cheating, which didn't make sense because it wasn't a game, it was a fight. How do you cheat? Though for some reasons Iruka-sensei wouldn't pair him up with Sasuke. It sucked too because Naruto could totally beat him now. After 2 months he'd gotten the highest grade in shinobi sign in his class, and outside of it he'd finally gotten to the advanced book. He was able to sign faster and smoother than when he'd first started, and he was better than even Sasuke. It didn't matter that Naruto had 10 times the amount of practice or was learning out of necessity, he was better than the so-called genius Uchiha. The raven-haired boy hated him even more for it, but that was okay. He didn't know, and if Naruto had his way he never would. He and Konohamaru were practicing still, and the boy was getting better. His signs were sloppy and his grammar was off, but he was steadily improving. Nearly a month into their friendship, the brunette introduced him to his 2 friends and loyal followers, Udon and Moegi. They were nice kids, and even though he wasn't quite ready to tell anyone else about his hearing, he allowed them to join Konohamaru in his mini lessons with the blonde. The bond between them was slowly shifting from friends to brothers, and it was nice. Naruto had never been a big brother before, never had anyone rely on him in any capacity, and he liked it. Hokage Gigi liked that the two of them got along so well too, and that he wasn't getting his grandson into too much trouble. The blonde had no doubt that Shikamaru, on the other hand, was better than even he was, but the pineapple head didn't show it off in class or on tests. When they spoke during breaks, not during lunch because Naruto tended to be clumsy and knock things over, they learned the hard way. They used sign and the older boy knew words that he didn't. It was also Shikamaru who sparked his idea for Choji's name sign. It had taken him over a month to figure out what to use for his name. He was only using names with Hokage Gigi and Iruka-sensei, but he still didn't want to leave out his friend when he'd given one to Sasuke, even if it was an insult. Choji had been sad because he was being bullied again by some older kids who told him he was too fat to be a ninja. Naruto disagreed. He'd seen the Akamichi, and while he wasn't the most familiar with their clan techniques, he was fairly certain their body expanding techniques wouldn't be nearly as effective if he were Naruto or Shikamaru's size instead. Choji had appreciated it, and they ended up talking about clan techniques. Shikamaru had mentioned one that Choji had been trying to avoid. The oldest of the 3 had been embarrassed, but Naruto hadn't seen why because it was awesome. The Akamichi kid, with the help of a special pill, turned their chakra into butterfly wings. Naruto had been adamant that Choji just be himself and to embrace the techniques passed down to him from his family, and the heir had been inspired by it. Naruto's lack of parents was common knowledge. Mostly, Naruto knew Shikamaru had warned his friend in case he accidentally hurt his feelings, and he knew how important it was to him that he not reject his family. His sign name became Butterfly because it was something important to him. He didn't tell him about it though. Not yet. Coming up with names for his other friend and his classmates had taken much less time. Shikamaru's was Genius signed into an S. Kiba's was Dog signed into a K. Sakura-chan's was Cherry Blossom. Sasuke Tamiz was bastard signed from an S. Shino's was bug signed into an S. Hinata's was shy signed with an H. Lastly, Ino's was blonde signed with an I. The names he decided on were basic, based on what he saw based on their appearance. He actually didn't know any of his classmates that well since most of them went through such great lengths to avoid him except for Shikamaru, Choji and Shino, but they came up a lot in conversation and name signs were faster than fingerspelling. He was still thinking of names for Konohamaru and his little gang. He knew how much the boy's name meant to him and he wanted him to approve of his choice, but Lee and Guy Sensei had practically given themselves their names. Lee was eyebrow. Naruto wasn't sorry, and Guy Sensei's was green because of his nickname. Shino didn't speak often, but at some point he decided that Naruto was worth talking to on occasion. He learned that the older boy liked learning shinobi sign and appreciated that Naruto didn't hurt his bugs. The blonde didn't understand why he would hurt the bugs when they weren't hurting him, but quickly remembered that some people were just like that. He wondered if the scorn they both faced had been what led the clan heir to talk to him. Either way, his bugs were cool and Shino, despite his emotionless appearance, was actually really nice. Shikamaru and Choji had started inviting him to hang out outside of academy classes. Shino even joined them sometimes and Naruto was happy. His evenings were primarily spent with Iruka sensei and he even got to see Hokage Gigi more often and it was almost like family. Now there was only 2.5 months until the graduation exam and Naruto was ready for almost anything. He still had a ways to go with the Bunshin no Jutsu, but he'd get there. He would. Graduating, becoming a ninja was the only thing that would truly make everything perfect. At least until he became Hokage. Iruka wasn't a mother hen and he definitely wasn't a proud mother, okay? He wasn't. Probably. Naruto was practically living with him. He cooked him dinner most nights and when he didn't he treated him to ramen. Iruka taught him shinobi sign language, something the kid picked up astonishingly fast, and helped him with his homework. If he sounded like a proud parent when he spoke about Naruto's progress, it was purely pride in his ability to teach. That was all. And if he worried more than strictly necessary when Naruto showed up at his apartment for his tutoring looking like he spent the last week fighting for his life in the forest of death after training with Lee and Guy, it was only natural. Especially given his disability. Maybe he was a bit of a mother hen, but it was only because of how similar Naruto was to himself. It had nothing to do with the fact that the kid looked at him like he'd just given him a million ryo and the Hokages had. It had nothing to do with the fact that the ever-present loneliness that was always in the boy's shockingly blue eyes was outweighed by how happy he seemed to be in Iruka's presence. It wasn't something he understood because Guy was a Junin and, despite his eccentricity, a very skilled shinobi and the blonde had known the Hokage since he was a toddler. Iruka was nothing compared to either, in skill or anything else. Naruto didn't seem to agree if the look in his eyes had anything to say about it whenever he even mentioned it. Part of the Tanchunin knew he didn't deserve the look of adoration Naruto graced him with. The rest, a much larger part, didn't want it to fade because he felt the same. He was his brother in all but blood, practically his own child even despite the size gap being too small to really pass as a parent to a preteen. Naruto, even at the tender age of 12, was one of the strongest people Iruka had ever met. He somehow managed to live in a village that despised him, where he was alone, still able to smile. Iruka had never faced the level of scorn Naruto had and it had almost made him walk a path of self-destruction. His talk with the Hokage saved him. At the very least, Iruka wanted Naruto to know that he had people who cared about him. That loved him, because Iruka did. It was a startling realization, at first, because he remembered looking at the blonde once and hating him. He also remembered meeting him, really meeting him and wondering how anyone, including himself, ever could because he'd never met anyone more selfless and lonely in his life. But looking at a child, someone he'd really only known for a couple years, and thinking of them as his was new. But was it really? It was only after he really thought about it that he realized it wasn't that new. He worried over Naruto's eating habits and made sure he got enough sleep. Iruka helped him study and cooked him dinners. He prepared his lunches and cared for him. Weren't those things something a parent did? If Iruka could afford a larger apartment, he'd ask the kid to live with him so even after he was no longer his student the scarred man could watch out for him. Even without living together, though, Iruka knew Naruto wouldn't simply cast him aside. He valued his loved ones too much for that. It was obvious by how careful the blonde was with his schedule, always making sure he spent time with everyone. Even if everyone was only Iruka, the Hokage, Shikamaru, Guy and Lee, and sometimes Shino and Choji, they were becoming close quickly, even if they weren't quite there yet, for now. It was only when Iruka thought back to how Naruto and Guy's first meeting had gone that he realized just how much of a parent he'd truly become. Naruto had been uncharacteristically nervous, or perhaps, had finally trusted him enough to express his anxiety freely, to meet Guy. Iruka kept his large hand on the small boy's back to keep him moving forward. He didn't believe Naruto would make a run for it, but it would be better for everyone if they quelled the 12-year-old's fears as quickly as possible. It hurt to know just how much the village's treatment of him actually affected the blonde. When they approached the two spandex-clad shinobi, Naruto retreated behind the Chunin, burying his face in his lower back. It would have been cute if his student were about 6 years younger. As it stood, it was still pretty cute, and Naruto was so small he hardly looked like he'd be turning 13 later that year, but it was still sad that something like this was even happening. If someone were to tell him Naruto would ever be so frightened before their bond grew, he'd never have believed them. Iruka probably would have even laughed in the person's face for even suggesting such a thing, but if he'd learned anything over the last few months, it was that Naruto was an expert at hiding how he really felt. He masked his pain behind a grin and masked his fear with false cockiness. Iruka was similar when he was young, but he'd never been nearly as persecuted as Naruto was. If either Guy or Lee were offended by Naruto's fear, neither showed it. The Junin only grinned down at Naruto's exposed sky-blue eye while Lee looked unsure of what to say. "Yosh, I'm Konoha's sublime green beast of prey, Maida Guy. This is my most youthful student Rock Lee. It's a pleasure meeting you, Naruto-kun." Guy's voice was loud as usual, but for once Iruka didn't think it would be a bad thing. Lee straightened his back before bowing politely. "And nice to meet you." It was hard to tell from the angle, but Iruka would swear he saw Naruto's eyes widen as he clearly heard what the man said. He smiled warmly at the blonde when he turned his blue eyes on the Chunin. Slowly, Naruto stepped out from behind Iruka and gave the pair a small smile. "Nice to meet you." He looked at Iruka once again, the question clear in his eyes, but it wasn't up to the Chunin. Naruto had to decide if he wanted them to know on his own. Anyo, I was wondering if you could help me learn a style of taijutsu that would fit better than the academy one. I have trouble hearing, so anything that relies on my ears doesn't do me any good." Naruto looked terrified to have admitted such a thing to two complete strangers, but neither of the two wavered. "I would appreciate it if you kept that to yourselves." His anxiety was almost tangible, but both nin swore. "How youthful. I too have a disability, Naruto-kun." Lee was practically beaming. "I can't gather chakra, so I became a shinobi by becoming exceptional at taijutsu. Through hard work your youthfulness will burn brightly." Naruto didn't seem to understand the last bit, though few did, but he seemed to relax more knowing that Lee wasn't another Sasuke. When Guy saw the blonde becoming more comfortable, he asked Lee to do his usual warm-up and asked him to coach the blonde while he spoke to Iruka. As a man who worked himself to the bone on a regular basis and burned more calories than any normal shinobi even consumed, it was obvious he'd be careful about maintaining his health. He immediately had concerns over Naruto's, and it was nice to see an adult besides the Hokage care about the blonde's well-being. "I know you said he was small, but I wasn't expecting him to be that small." Guy's voice was about as quiet as it would get, but neither boy was paying attention, so it didn't matter. "I know. Believe it or not, this is actually better than it was before. I've been able to get him eating more than ramen, and he's finally starting to fill out a bit more. He's still the shortest in class, but at least his weight is more regular. I'm pretty sure it was lower than most of the girls before. As it stands, he's barely 40 kilograms. I see." Guy paused for a moment as he figured out how to handle it. "We'll start slow, but you'll need to make sure you up his calories, otherwise he'll start losing weight or worse, pass out during training." It turned out to be a good thing for Naruto because it meant he could eat ramen more often, even if Iruka insisted he get more vegetables in his bowl. When they left that first day, Naruto was drained. His muscles were sore and he was covered in sweat, but he didn't seem too down about it. He and Lee had bonded quite well, and the green-clad pair both figured out fairly quickly where and when to push the blonde and when to give him a rest. His stamina was impressive, especially for his size, but he was new to such intensive training and it would take a while before he was anywhere close to even Lee's level. It was nice to see Naruto creating a bond with someone who had more skill than him that wasn't a one-sided rivalry. Lee made it quite obvious that he looked forward to when he and Naruto would be able to properly spar. Despite the obvious separation of skill, they saw each other as equals, and it was rare for a graduated genin to look at academy students in such a way. Iruka attended the first few training sessions for Naruto's comfort, but not long after that the blonde was finally okay with going on his own. Though he often came back looking worse for wear, and bad for Iruka's heart. Iruka could see the progress he was making clearly and the improvements were clear as day in his spars. The blonde had also taken to calling the pair, Bushy Brows, and Bushier Brows Sensei, and gave them sign names Iruka felt were highly appropriate. Guy's was easy enough, simply the sign for green signed over his eyebrow, and easier still was Lee's. Naruto had given him the sign name Eyebrow, and upon telling them that information, Lee seemed eager to learn about sign and deaf culture. The more friends he gained, the happier Naruto became, and Iruka was proud to be able to watch him finally receive the acknowledgement he wanted so badly. Iruka was definitely a mom. Aburame Shino wasn't a people person. People tended to be freaked out by his clan, by the fact that they allow insects to colonize beneath their skin. It was as much a fact for the Aburame as it was for the bullying the Akamichi usually received before growing into themselves and their power, and something few people could look past. Shino never expected Uzumaki Naruto to be one of those few. The blonde was different from anyone he'd ever met before, a wealth of contradictions, an enigma. Nothing he did made any sense. Shino wasn't an idiot by any means, but trying to put together the puzzle that was Naruto definitely made him feel like one. There was something about him he was missing, something Shikamaru had definitely figured out, because as good as he was at keeping secrets, he wasn't nearly as talented at hiding the fact that he knew it all. Years spent in the same class told him a lot about the blonde. He was a spaz and hyperactive and loud. He was, and barely mediocre at everything, and an idiot. He never paid attention, he was physically weak, and he was always alone. Shino had always sympathized with the last part, but his volume and his brand of idiocy was never something he could back. In order to keep his Kakaichu in check, he needed to be in control of his emotions, and Naruto was the exact opposite of that. He never bothered to look closer until he answered something correctly in class. Something particularly obscure that even he hadn't considered, and he was one of the top students in the class, not that anyone noticed, what with the last Uchiha in the number 1 spot. Even the blonde himself had been surprised he'd gotten it right. Iruka-sensei had behaved differently leading up to the correct answer, and Shino was sure their Chunin teacher was privy to the secret as well. He kept acting differently in the days and later weeks following the incident. Naruto continued to get the majority of answers right, and suddenly they were all learning sign language. Shikamaru was sitting with Naruto at lunch and chatting with him between breaks, and Iruka-sensei seemed to be paying even closer attention to Naruto than he had in the past. He looked proud and worried all at once, and it reminded him of his mother and the parents of other students, since his father couldn't let himself become emotional with his Kakaichu. Naruto started having real lunches that looked suspiciously similar to Iruka-sensei's, and he was getting better grades in the Shinobi Sign Language unit than anyone else in class, including Uchiha Sasuke. It was an interesting unit, one he hadn't expected to enjoy but did anyway. He suspected it was because he didn't care much for talking, and one Naruto enjoyed before receiving his first graded assignment, which was especially rare. It was the main reason he started talking to his blonde classmate, if he was honest. Naruto, over the several weeks leading up to their first proper conversation, had managed to lower his volume, though only marginally. Most shocking though, was that when one of his beetles crawled over Naruto's hand while the blonde had been repositioning his hand for sign language practice, he didn't react negatively. He didn't swat at her or shake her away or make a disgusted noise. He smiled at her gently before holding his hand out to Shino so the Aburame could take the insect back. He'd apologized for losing his near-perfect control, of course, but the Uzumaki had only looked confused, even defending his Kakaichu. When he thanked him for sparing the beetle's life, he'd looked baffled by that too. Overall, Naruto had proven to be almost the opposite of what he'd assumed, and Shino quickly learned the reason for most of his behaviors. The village, civilians and even some shinobi, looked at Naruto like he was some kind of pest that needed to be exterminated. Like the way his clan was looked at but on steroids. He wasn't sure what the blonde did, if anything, for the villagers to treat him in such a way. He only expressed the true sadness and loneliness he felt when he thought no one was watching. His pranks were obviously a cry for attention, and since this whole chain of events began, such pranks were few and far between. He even seemed happier and less lonely. Conversations between himself and Naruto became more frequent. They were still brief because Naruto was a lot, and being in the presence of someone with as much chakra as it turned out the blonde had was draining to his insects. Before he even knew it, the blonde was inviting Shino to sit with him and Shikamaru and Choji. Having friends, not being alone, Shino decided, was nice. Being friends with someone like Naruto was probably the nicest though. It was nice not being forgotten. Naruto had never had to worry about making time for so many people before. It was hard, for sure, but it was also awesome. People, real, living people wanted to spend time with him. It was new and exciting and utterly terrifying. Terrifying because he couldn't screw this up. Not after finally having a taste of what friends were like. He'd gotten used to spending his lunch waves with others, specifically with Shikamaru and Choji, and not always being alone outside of school. Iruka had become something like a parent, and while they didn't live together, Naruto had spent plenty of time in the man's apartment. They often ate dinner together, and he'd fallen asleep on his shoulder more than once. He came with him when he met Guy-sensei. He congratulated him when he did well on tests and ruffled his hair like he saw other parents do. It was practically his dream come true, and to screw up because of favoritism just wouldn't happen. He spent lunches and breaks in class with Shikamaru, with Choji and or Shino joining them most of the time. He spent time directly after classes every other day with Lee and Guy-sensei practicing taijutsu, and then almost every evening was spent with Iruka-sensei. They practiced shinobi sign, ate dinner, worked on homework and went over class notes together. Afternoons on days he wasn't with Guy-sensei and Lee were spent with Konohamaru, teaching him sign and helping him escape his tutor for a little while. Hokage Jiji was really the only one he didn't regularly spend time with. He was a busy man and didn't often have time, but Naruto tried to visit once per week regardless. When plans changed for whatever reason, he made sure to let everyone involved know and always rescheduled, and he was happy. It was only after reflecting on it that he realized he hadn't picked a fight with Sasuke in months. The pale boy's glares had gotten harsher and his words more cutting, but he'd stopped rising to the bait. Naruto wondered if Sasuke was bitter that he was no longer concerned with being his rival. Of course, that didn't mean he backed down, though it would be nice if Iruka-sensei would pair him up with the bastard for a spar just so he could wipe his smug smirk off his face. He wouldn't waste the time he could be spending with his friends fighting with a jerk though. It was too troublesome, as Shikamaru would no doubt say. The other kids in class, or most of them anyway, had even stopped making fun of him, at least openly. In fact, the only ones who ever had anything negative to say to his face was Sasuke and his fan club. Even Kiba, who'd been particularly bitter early on, had stopped making fun of him, and while they still weren't friends, they, at least, were no longer constantly at odds. That didn't change the fact that he liked Akamaru better. Everything in his life was almost perfect, it had become so close to what he'd always dreamed, and to lose it now would probably destroy him. The only hurdle left seemed to be graduating. He was finally getting good grades on written tests, actually winning his taijutsu spars. Thank you Guy-sensei and Lee. And he had the best grades in the sign language unit. Did it matter if he had extra practice? Naruto didn't think it counted if he needed it. His transformations were finally good enough to actually fool people. And with that, his new technique was finally complete. And his kawarimi had gotten faster and smoother too. But even after everything, no matter what anyone did, he still couldn't do the bunshin. No one could figure out why either, which made it all the more frustrating. Shikamaru often told him not to worry too much, since after they graduate he could learn a different type of clone, but he wanted to be able to do it now. Kurama couldn't help much either. He made a weird metaphor that Naruto hadn't quite understood about a needle and yarn and made him practice chakra control instead of teaching him anything interesting. It helped, but barely. Instead of looking like pale blobs, they just looked like blobs. Naruto was just glad there was any improvement at all. 2 days before the exam would be his last officially scheduled training day with Guy-sensei and Lee. The older boy was overly emotional about it, but Naruto assured him that of course they could still train together sometimes, he would just have less time when he got his own genin team. Lee squeezed him in a nearly suffocating hug and got tears all over him while Naruto awkwardly patted his back. Kurama thought it was funny, though. Even though he'd only trained with them for a few months, he'd grown a lot, not taller, as Kurama loved to throw in his face, but stronger. He was less skinny and more toned, and while he still wasn't nearly as strong as either taijutsu specialist, he only did the training for a few months while Lee had over a year and Gai-sensei had his whole life before Naruto was even born. The change was noticeable. He'd heard Iruka-sensei and Gai-sensei talking about it once before, and Hokage Gigi had even commented on it over the months. Naruto was happy, knowing his hard work was finally paying off. That last training session was more rigorous than anything they'd done before, and while he still couldn't beat Lee with taijutsu alone, he was better. He lasted longer before the older boy took him down, and he knew it was because he was getting better, because Lee would never, not in a million years, throw a fight. In all his life, Naruto had never before felt so confident in himself and his abilities. He decided it was a nice feeling and, like Lee, vowed to continue working hard to maintain that confidence and also back it up. That didn't mean he wanted to be on the receiving end of one of Lee's Konoha senpu. He was currently enjoying his life and would like to continue living it, thanks. Naruto went home that day more sore than he'd ever been before. Even the first week wasn't like this, but the ache only pushed him harder. Yes, he would definitely continue training with them. Inuzuka Kiba had never been what he would consider friends with Uzumaki Naruto. His pranks were fun and surprisingly involved, and he'd been a great skipping buddy, but they weren't friends. When the blonde failed the graduation exam twice, any positive relationship they had faded because, really, who was so bad that they failed twice? He was the heir to a prominent clan in Konoha and couldn't be seen hanging around someone so incompetent. His parents had asked about it once, since his skipping becoming less frequent was certainly a feat. His father had been particularly happy to learn of his choice to distance himself from Naruto, something he hadn't quite understood since the blonde had never wronged his family. His mother hadn't been nearly as happy with his decision and lectured him for hours about loyalty. She wasn't Naruto's biggest fan either, so Kiba didn't get why it mattered so much to her. Adults were weird. Then Naruto got smart. Maybe he'd always been smart? But then why did he act like an idiot? The change threw the entire class off balance. Instead of talking bad behind his back, students had created a number of possible explanations for the change. A body double, a secret genius, a clone. There were more, but Kiba didn't care to remember them. The reason for the change didn't matter because it wasn't the only problem, and Kiba knew they were wrong anyway. His scent hadn't changed at all beyond getting healthier, and since Kiba could often smell the lunches he started bringing in, he could clearly see why. He wondered where he was getting the food from, since Naruto would never choose a real meal over ramen. Shikamaru, the laziest, most unmotivated person anyone knew, started actively spending time with him. In the weeks leading up to that change, there'd been an odd look in his eyes, like the pineapple head was trying to solve a puzzle, whenever he looked at the blonde. Where Shikamaru went, Choji was sure to follow, and honestly Kiba wasn't sure why the Akamichi even wanted to be a ninja when it was obvious he cared more about food. He guessed food was the reason he and Naruto got along so well. Even Shino, someone who was so quiet Kiba actually tended to forget was even there, started talking to Naruto. The blonde wasn't even freaked out by the bugs living under his skin. Kiba was pretty sure the shortest kid in class was actually an alien the entire time. Kiba could understand dogs and had heightened senses, and Naruto thought the bug boy was awesome. How the hell did that work? He was almost tempted to start talking to the kid himself, to figure out what was going on, but he didn't. Instead, in something he hoped would reach the socially stunted blonde, he made an unspoken acknowledgement. He'd acknowledge that Naruto wasn't the incompetent moron he thought he was. If anyone seemed unhappy about the massive change in the blonde, it was Sasuke. For all that Naruto clearly drove the Uchiha crazy, he seemed even more angry with being overlooked by the prankster. Naruto no longer actively picked fights or really even looked at the raven-haired teen anymore. His fangirls seemed happy, especially Sakura, because Naruto hadn't even glanced her way since he started changing, even if she seemed slightly offended. Kiba didn't get it at all. Every time they fought, Sasuke ridiculed the blonde for his incompetence and often rejected his challenges. So why was he angry that Naruto was finally doing what he asked? Kiba would be ecstatic if the number one annoyance in his life, fleas, would listen when he told them to go away. All the dog user wanted was for everyone to stop acting so weird. He just wanted to graduate so he could get away from this madness. Just one more day to go. Shikamaru was worried for Naruto, not that he'd ever tell him that. The likelihood of the cloning technique not being a part of the exam was slim and the blonde was still struggling with it. He suspected it had something to do with the extreme amount of chakra he had. It was nearly as much as Choza did after eating a large meal. He'd seen his father practicing, because sparring was a bit too strong of a word to use for what his father was doing, with Inoichi and Choza before, and the Akamichi's ability to turn calories into chakra was crazy. Especially considering Naruto just seemed to have that much. It was rare for shinobi to have so much chakra on their own, let alone a civilian boy. It would be so much more helpful if he knew who his parents were. If Naruto's complaints about the Hokage's refusal to talk about the matter meant anything, then they were probably high-ranking shinobi before they died, but Shikamaru had never heard the name Uzumaki before. There was nothing about any Uzumaki anywhere in the history books he currently had access to, and when he'd asked his father, he too had been pretty hush-hush. It was extremely troublesome. He wouldn't have access to anything better until after he made Genin, and no one wanted to tell him or Naruto anything. If Shikamaru didn't know any better, he'd think Naruto was the son of the late Yondaime Hokage. He wasn't quite sure why he was so invested in finding information on something so incredibly troublesome, but it was probably because Naruto had become his friend. A good friend too. Shikamaru had been unsure of how genuine he'd be able to be when he first decided to befriend the blonde, but quickly found himself drawn in. Naruto was magnetic. If you got close enough, you were drawn in, and there was very little that could be done about it. He was loud and naive and bright and determined. Despite everything the world, or rather, the village, has thrown at him, he kept fighting for the acknowledgement he wanted. He even seemed happier when Shikamaru was around, which was odd because normally people were angry when he just wanted to laze around and cloudwatch, but Naruto only smiled and laughed and offered to cloudwatch with him. He had trouble keeping still, and they couldn't talk since he couldn't hear anything Shikamaru said, but they both found themselves enjoying it. He never once made fun of Choji's weight, something that only Shikamaru had ever done before, and encouraged his eating habits. After learning about the Akamichi clan techniques, he'd practically blown up, going full mom friend mode, telling Choji that if he wanted to be a ninja he had to keep his body weight high so his techniques didn't make him sick. Apparently the help he'd been getting in taijutsu and his own new diet, courtesy of Iruka-sensei, had actually been educational. It was probably because even with actual muscle under his skin he was still tiny, and if he didn't eat a lot of calories it made him sick or pass out. Either way, it was something neither Shikamaru nor Choji himself had ever heard anyone outside the Akamichi clan say before. He and Choji became even better friends after that, and the three of them started to hang out often, though Naruto was reluctant to eat out with them anywhere but the ramen place. He assumed that it was probably because they treated him like family, but seeing so many people, strangers, glaring at the blonde for no reason had angered both himself and Choji. When Naruto tried to pacify them, saying he was used to it, had the opposite effect. So instead they decided to stay at the Nara clan compound. It had actually been his father's suggestion, and while Naruto had been even more reluctant, he'd eventually given in. The blonde looked surprised when the glares he usually received on the streets of Konoha were completely non-existent within the walls of the compound. Even the Nara clan deer even liked him, something that surprised everyone because loud noises tended to spook them more often than not, and Naruto was certainly loud. After an incident that ended with the blonde surrounded by deer while they napped, watching clouds, his father kept giving him a funny look whenever he brought up Naruto's name. He didn't get it, but he had a feeling knowing would be more troublesome than staying ignorant. What a drag. For the exam they had an assistant teacher, a white-haired guy named Mizuki, who apparently taught the other class, and Naruto disliked him immediately. Kurama called it gut instinct, but Naruto called it survival because if looks could kill, the glare the man gave him when Iruka-sensei wasn't looking would have left little more than ashes. He explained the written test and passed them out. It was easy enough. Iruka-sensei and Shikamaru had prepared him for everything, and he knew he passed the written portion. After they turned their tests in, Iruka-sensei went to the classroom next door to set it up while Mizuki-sensei explained the second part of the exam. When your name is called, you will head to the classroom next door and perform the Bunshin no Jutsu. Your performance will be graded, and if you pass, you will be awarded an official Konoha Hite 8 and become a genin shinobi of the village. Naruto's heart sank and he slammed his head on his desk hard. Shikamaru gave him a worried look and the blonde barely managed to hold back his tears. Why did things always have to go wrong after going so well?
That's all for now. If you enjoy this video, then please like, share and do comments.